Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, The Watchers, a city that sees everything. I had never been one to enjoy the commute, but that morning it felt particularly stifling. The city was already awake when I left the apartment, the streets humming with the usual buzz of early traffic and hurried footsteps. I preferred walking over taking the subway when the weather was okay. It gave me a chance to clear my head before work, but today the air was thick and felt a little heavier than usual, like the city itself had been holding its breath. My route took me past a few corner shops and a small park, the one with the cracked benches and a tired-looking fountain that hadn't worked in years. Kids were already gathering near the playground, their laughter sharp and high-pitched, slicing through the monotony of the morning rush. I usually didn't notice much on these walks, just the usual mix of people on their way somewhere, the occasional dog walker, the delivery guys balancing oversized packages, but today, something felt off. I first caught sight of him near the bakery on Elm Street. He was standing outside the store's glass window, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. His face was obscured beneath a baseball cap pulled low, and he stared inside without blinking, completely still. I recognized the guy from around the neighborhood, just a few blocks down from my apartment. He wasn't someone I'd ever spoken to, and until now, I'd only seen him in passing, usually keeping to himself. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, but his presence there was unusual. The bakery didn't open for another 15 minutes, and the street was relatively empty, so there wasn't a reason for him to be standing there, just watching the inside of the store with that fixed, unblinking gaze. I slowed down, half expecting him to move, but he just stayed where he was, unmoving. I walked past without making eye contact, but I could feel his eyes on me long after I was out of sight. That feeling of being watched made my skin crawl, but I tried to ignore it, blaming the early hour and the lingering sleepiness in my mind. The rest of the walk was uneventful, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that same figure trailing me. Nothing. Just the usual city sounds, the distant honk of a horn, sneakers pounding on asphalt, the occasional shout from a street vendor. Still, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, an inexplicable unease I couldn't shake. At work, my colleagues noticed my distracted mood but didn't press. I managed to get through the morning meetings, though my thoughts kept drifting back to that man outside the bakery. Around noon, I stepped out for lunch and decided to take a detour through the park I'd passed earlier. I figured a change of scenery might help clear my head. The park was busier now, the playground filled with children and their parents, the sun filtering through the trees in dappled patterns. I found a bench away from the crowd and pulled out my phone. That's when I noticed a small slip of paper tucked under the bench. It was a torn piece of a receipt or maybe a note, nothing substantial at first glance. I unfolded it carefully and saw a series of numbers scribbled hastily, no context, no words, just the numbers. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the park was bustling with activity. I slipped the paper into my pocket, feeling a flicker of curiosity mixed with a vague sense of foreboding. As I sat there, I noticed a man nearby who seemed vaguely familiar. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a dark coat despite the warmth of the day. He stood just beyond the edge of the playground, his gaze fixed not on the children but on me. There was something about the way he watched, too deliberate, too calculating. When our eyes met briefly, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod as if acknowledging something between us. I felt a chill despite the sun. I stood up, deciding not to linger, and as I turned to leave, I caught sight of the man from the bakery again. He was sitting on another bench, arms folded, staring at the ground. It seemed like too much of a coincidence. I crossed the park quickly and made my way back to the office, my phone buzzing with messages I barely registered. When I finally sat down, I pulled out the slip of paper again and stared at the numbers. They made no sense to me, no phone number, no recognizable code. Just strings of digits. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a random scrap someone dropped. But the unease tightened its grip on me. The way those two men had watched me, the strange note, the blurred edges of what had been an ordinary day, it all felt like the first pieces of something I couldn't yet understand. By the time I left work, the streets had shifted. Evening brought a colder air, and the usual crowd had thinned. I took a different route home, intentionally avoiding the bakery and the park. The city lights blurred around me, and I kept my head down, trying not to look at the shadows gathering in alleyways. As I turned onto my street, I saw the man from the bakery again. He was standing outside my apartment building, leaning against the wall as if waiting. This time, he looked up and met my gaze directly. No cap to hide his face, just an expression I couldn't read. Neither friendly nor hostile, just empty and unreadable. I paused, heart pounding, then forced myself to keep walking. Inside, I locked the door behind me and checked the peephole. Nobody was there. I sat down on the couch, hands trembling slightly, and pulled out the slip of paper one last time. The sense of something closing in was undeniable. The day had started like any other, but it was clear now that whatever was happening wasn't random. It was deliberate, and I was caught in the middle of it. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the heater and the occasional distant siren, sounds that usually faded into the background but now seemed sharper, more intrusive. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to will my racing thoughts into silence, but they twisted into worst-case scenarios faster than I could stop them. After what felt like hours, I finally slid out of bed and shuffled to the kitchen for a glass of water. My phone screen lit up the dark as I thumbed through the recent messages. Mostly work stuff, some texts from friends checking in, none mentioning anything unusual. None of them knew what I was dealing with, or at least, what I thought I was dealing with. Trying to distract myself, I opened the news app. The headlines were the same dull mix of politics, weather, and traffic. Nothing about break-ins or assaults in the neighborhood. But that didn't mean anything. I'd learned from experience that the news only covered the worst incidents, not the slow, subtle things that build up under the surface. I glanced at the slip of paper again, the numbers still inscrutable. I pulled out a notepad and started copying them down. Maybe if I looked at them long enough, something would click. The numbers were arranged in 3 clusters, separated by dashes. Each cluster was about 5 or 6 digits long, but there was no pattern I could see, not like a phone number or a date. A sudden noise from the living room made me jump. A soft thud, like something knocked over. I froze, heart pounding. It was probably the cat. I'd left a few things on the floor near her bed. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I grabbed a baseball bat from under the couch, the one I bought after an unrelated break-in a few years ago, and checked the apartment. Nothing out of place. The window was locked, the door bolted. I dropped the bat back on the couch and sat down, trying to convince myself to stop looking for trouble. But then I noticed something I hadn't before, the faintest scratch marks on the lock of the front door. Not deep, just a few lines, almost as if someone had tried to pick it with a thin tool. I didn't remember seeing them earlier in the day. My mind raced. Was it the man from the bakery? Or the older guy in the park? It was hard to tell if I was imagining connections or if there really was something going on. I felt both the urge to call the police and the hesitation that maybe this was all in my head. Not wanting to seem like I was overreacting, I stayed quiet. The next morning, I left the apartment early, taking a different path to work. The street was empty, the sun just beginning to peek over the rooftops. I passed the bakery and glanced inside, but the man wasn't there. A small relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling he was somewhere nearby, watching. At the corner store, I bought a cheap disposable camera. I told the cashier it was for a project, not wanting to admit I planned to use it to keep an eye on the neighborhood. The plan was simple: take pictures during my walks, see if I could catch anything unusual, anything that might explain the feeling of being watched. During lunch, I went back to the park. The usual crowd was there, parents chatting, kids running wild, and I retraced my steps to the bench where I found the note. It was gone. I stared at the spot for a long time, wondering if someone had retrieved it, or if I'd imagined it all together. Then I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a flower pot near the playground. I moved closer and unfolded it carefully. This time, it wasn't numbers but a short message: stop looking. It's not safe. My hands trembled. Someone was trying to warn me or threaten me. There was no signature, no explanation. I didn't know what frightened me more, that someone was paying attention to me that closely, or that they wanted me to back off. As I pocketed the note, my eyes landed on the older man from the park. He was standing near the edge of the playground, watching me again. When our eyes met, I saw no nod this time, only a cold, unreadable expression. He turned and walked away without a word. That evening, I called my friend Mia and told her about everything: the man, the notes, the scratches on the lock. She listened quietly, then reminded me not to jump to conclusions but promised to check in on me more often. It was the first time I'd shared any of it out loud, and it helped calm the knot in my stomach just a little. Before hanging up, she asked if I wanted her to come over that night. I hesitated, then agreed. When she arrived, I felt a little safer, the weight of the day lessened by her presence. We talked for a while about everything except what was really on my mind, trying to keep things normal. Later, when she was asleep on the couch, I heard footsteps outside the window. I peeked through the curtain and saw a shadowy figure standing across the street, motionless. I couldn't see a face, but the posture was unmistakably familiar. I swallowed hard and closed the curtain slowly. The feeling that this was just beginning settled over me like a cold fog. But for now, at least, I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke stiff and groggy from restless sleep. Mia had left early, before I was fully conscious, after promising to text me later. The apartment felt colder without her there, almost empty. I lay for a moment staring at the ceiling, trying to anchor myself in the ordinary hum of a weekday morning, but the threads of unease from the night before were tangled too tightly. I got up and moved mechanically through my routine: shower, coffee, dress. The sky outside was gray and overcast, rain threatening but not yet falling. I debated whether to walk to work or take the subway. The subway felt claustrophobic at the best of times, especially now with the lingering tension pressing on my chest, but walking meant risking another encounter. I decided on the subway. As I left the apartment, I double-checked the lock on the door. The faint scratches on the deadbolt had faded into the wood grain, but the memory of them remained sharp. I pocketed the slip of paper with the numbers and the folded note, both now folded small enough to disappear in my palm. The hallway smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and something else, maybe dampness from the rain the previous day. I stepped into the stairwell and descended 2 flights, then exited onto the street. The city was quieter than usual for the hour, the damp pavement reflecting the dim light. At the corner, the bakery was still closed. The air smelled faintly of yeast and sugar from the ovens, but no sign of a man. I considered stopping to look around but pushed on. I made my way to the subway station, swiping my card and descending the stairs. The platform was nearly empty, a handful of people waiting silently. I took a seat on a bench near the wall, trying to blend in and avoid drawing attention. I noticed then a man across the platform, standing close to the edge but not moving. His coat was dark, collar turned up, and a baseball cap shadowed his face. My heart pinched. It was the bakery man. I looked away quickly, pretending to check my phone, but the sense of being watched pulsed through me like a live wire. He didn't leave. When the train arrived, the doors hissed open, and he stepped back but didn't board. I exhaled quietly and boarded the train, finding a spot near the middle car. I stared out the window as the city blurred past, but the feeling that something was following me never left. Work was a frenzy of emails and meetings that day, but I couldn't focus. Every time the phone buzzed, every unexpected knock at the door, my heart jumped. Around mid-afternoon, I took a break and called Mia again. She answered right away, sounding concerned. I told her about the man on the subway platform. She asked if I had told the building superintendent or considered filing a report. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it, pretend it was a coincidence, but the other part was screaming that this was something more. I promised to at least mention it to the superintendent. After the call, I left the office early, deciding to walk the rest of the way home despite the drizzling rain. The streets were slick and shiny under the streetlights, the city muffled by the steady fall of rain. I took a longer route, cutting through quieter residential blocks instead of the main avenues. The streets were empty except for an occasional passerby under an umbrella. Near the halfway point, I paused to tie my shoe. When I looked up, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the shadows beside a narrow alley. The figure shifted slightly but didn't step forward. I froze, heart pounding. The coat looked familiar, dark, heavy, the collar turned up high. The familiar baseball cap was pulled low. The bakery man. I swallowed hard and started walking again, faster this time. The sound of my feet splashing in puddles echoed unnervingly. When I glanced back, he was gone. I didn't dare slow down until I was safely back in the apartment building lobby, where the warm light and the buzz of the front desk felt like a barrier against the outside. The superintendent was there, a stocky middle-aged man named Mr. Jenkins. I hadn't talked to him much beyond the usual greetings, but I swallowed my discomfort and brought up the man. "Someone's been hanging around outside," I said quietly. "I've seen him near the bakery, the park, the subway station. Today, near the apartment too." He frowned, his expression grim. "You sure it's nothing you're imagining? Sometimes people just linger for their own reasons." "It feels deliberate," I said. "Like he's watching me." Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. "I'll keep an eye out, but you should be careful. If you see him again, call me or the police." I thanked him and went up to my apartment, the sense of being watched heavier than ever. Inside, I locked the door and checked the windows. I pulled the curtains closed, the familiar small space suddenly feeling like a cage. Then I heard a faint tapping at the window. I froze. The sound came again, 3 taps, deliberate, measured. I moved cautiously to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. There was no one there. Just the empty street, wet and glistening. I stepped back, heart hammering. Was it a trick of the rain? Or someone trying to get my attention? I pulled out my phone and texted Mia. Something just tapped on my window. I'm not sure if I'm losing it. Almost immediately, her reply came. "Stay where you are. Lock everything. I'm on my way." For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. Not because the threat had gone away, but because I wasn't facing it alone. The hours stretched long and tense. Every noise seemed amplified, the creak of the radiator, the hum of the fridge, the scratch of rain against the glass. When Mia arrived, she brought coffee and an extra lock she'd bought on her way over. We reinforced the door and talked in low voices, trying to keep calm. She suggested I call the police the next day, and I agreed, knowing I couldn't keep living on edge. That night, I barely slept, the sound of rain a constant backdrop to the low buzz of anxiety that settled in my chest. But at least the tapping never came again. For now, the silence felt like a fragile shield, the eye of a storm that I knew wasn't over yet. Nia left shortly after dawn, promising she'd check in again that evening. I stood by the door, watching her disappear down the dim stairwell of my building, her figure swallowed up by the gray morning light. The apartment felt empty as soon as the door clicked shut behind her. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was thick, almost tactile, pressing against my skin. I went through the motions of making coffee, the familiar smell a small anchor, but I couldn't settle. My eyes kept flicking to the window, to the locked door, to the corners where shadows gathered. The rain from the day before had turned into a steady drizzle, the kind that makes the city smell wet and tired. I told myself I was just anxious, that the man I'd seen was probably just some random drifter, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. After a few hours of pacing and staring out the window, I pulled out the disposable camera. I'd taken a few pictures the previous days, mostly of street corners, benches, and the bakery. I hesitated before loading the film into the scanner at work. The images were grainy and soft in the low light, but there was something unmistakable. In one blurred photo of the park, a figure stood near the edge of the playground, dark coat, baseball cap low, watching. The man. His face was hidden, but the posture was the same. I didn't know what I expected to find, maybe proof I was imagining it all, but instead I found confirmation. And that only made it worse. Later that afternoon, the office felt suffocating. I could barely focus, every noise around me amplified, the tapping of keyboards, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, even the faint scrape of a chair leg against the floor. I noticed a colleague glance at me with concern, but I just smiled weakly and turned back to the screen. When the clock hit 5, I grabbed my coat and headed out. I'd planned to walk a new route home, something longer and busier, to avoid the familiar corners where I'd seen the man before. The sky was a dull slate, the light fading early, casting long shadows between buildings. The streets were wet from another fresh rain. I kept my head down, hands stuffed deep in my pockets, trying to appear oblivious. But I felt eyes on me, always eyes. From behind parked cars, across the street, from the upper floors of the apartment buildings. As I passed the corner store, the bell above the door jingled, and I froze. I looked up slowly, and there he was. Not the man from the bakery this time, but the older guy from the park. He stood just inside the doorway, coat buttoned, hands in pockets, his eyes locked on me as I passed. The flicker of recognition I'd felt before was replaced by something colder, heavier. I kept walking, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my throat, the way my heart hammered in my chest. That night, I didn't hear any tapping on the window, no footsteps outside. The apartment felt quieter than usual, the silence almost suffocating. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the slip of paper with the numbers and the note tucked beside it. I tried to make sense of the numbers again, but they remained cryptic, a code I couldn't break. The phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number: "You're watching too closely. Stop." My hands shook as I stared at the screen. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but I didn't. Instead, I texted back, "Who's this?" No reply. Minutes passed. The silence was louder than any words. I debated calling the police, but what could I say? That I'd been followed, watched, and threatened with nothing more than cryptic notes and shadows? The chances of them taking me seriously felt slim. And yet, the feeling of being hunted was undeniable. The next morning, I made coffee and sat by the window, the city waking slowly below. The man from the bakery wasn't outside, nor was the older man. I tried to convince myself that maybe this was the lull before something, or maybe it was the end. But when I checked the peephole, I saw a figure across the hall, standing just out of sight. A man. His coat was dark, the collar high, and the baseball cap was perched low on his head. I held my breath. After a moment, he moved away. I locked the door again, triple-checked the windows, and pulled the curtains tightly closed. I called Mia. She was on her way. When she arrived, I felt a small measure of relief, like a door had opened in the wall of tension around me. We sat in the living room, the lamp casting soft light over the room, trying to talk about anything but what was happening. Outside, the city carried on, cars honking in the distance, people shouting to one another, the hum of life going on as if nothing was wrong. But in here, we both knew it was far from over. For now, the watchers had stepped back, but only just. And the silence between those moments was heavier than anything else. I didn't sleep that night, waiting for something to happen, knowing it probably would. The question was when. And if I'd be ready. Morning crept in with a pale, reluctant light that barely touched the shadows clinging to the walls. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the window felt like a signal, an unseen presence just beyond sight, waiting. I kept the knife close, heart pounding, senses stretched thin, knowing this uneasy peace was just a lull before the storm. That morning, after Mia left and the apartment fell silent again, I found myself trapped in a routine I mechanically followed without much thought. The coffee machine sputtered and hissed, the steam curling into the air like a fragile shield against the heaviness pressing on my chest. I sat by the window, watching the city wake beneath a sky that refused to brighten. The usual hum of traffic was muffled, like the world had been turned down a notch, waiting. I flipped the slip of paper over in my hands, the faint creases worn smooth by now. The scribbled numbers made no sense, no pattern still. I tried to convince myself again that it was just some meaningless message, an odd prank, perhaps a stray piece of trash that had taken on significance only because my nerves were fraying. But the weight of those digits felt like a tether pulling tighter around my mind. The afternoon crept in slowly. I decided I needed to get out, to move, to shake the suffocating silence. The streets were damp from an early drizzle that had stopped just before noon, the air heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and old leaves. I grabbed my coat and phone, telling Mia I'd check in later, though I wasn't sure I'd be able to focus on anyone else's voice. I avoided the bakery and the park, sticking to streets I rarely traveled. The idea was to blend in, to disappear into the city's constant flow of faces. But the feeling of being watched was relentless. Every glance from a passerby held just a flicker of something: curiosity, calculation, maybe menace. Or maybe it was my imagination, but the line between the two blurred dangerously. I stopped at a small cafe, ordered a black coffee, and sat by the window. The place was quiet, the kind of neighborhood spot where regulars sat in silence, nursing drinks and tapping away on laptops. I pulled out the disposable camera and flicked through the photos I'd taken so far. The grainy images were frustrating, nothing clear enough to identify faces or details, but the man was there, lurking just beyond the edges of the frame like a shadow refusing to be fully captured. As I set the camera down, the bell over the door jingled. A man entered, mid-30s, hat pulled low, dark eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on the counter. He ordered a drink, then turned toward the window seat. My heart snapped tight. It wasn't the bakery man exactly, but something about the way he moved, the deliberate calm in his posture, sent a jolt through me. I looked down at my cup, trying to steady my breathing. He didn't approach, didn't make a move, but the undercurrent of his presence filled the room, a low hum of menace that I couldn't ignore. I glanced around. Other patrons seemed oblivious, lost in their own worlds. I could have gotten up, left, but something rooted me there, an instinct to watch, to see what he would do next. After a minute, or maybe 5, I wasn't sure if the man left without a word, stepping out into the street with quiet purpose. I waited a moment, then slipped out after him, keeping a safe distance. My steps echoed against wet pavement as I followed. He moved with a kind of casual confidence, as if every corner and alley were mapped out in his mind. We passed a narrow side street, and the man paused, glancing back over his shoulder. I ducked behind a parked car, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. His eyes swept the street, slow and deliberate, but he didn't spot me. After a few seconds, he continued on, vanishing into the maze of the city. I stood frozen for a long moment, the chill seeping through my coat. Part of me wanted to run, to shout for help, but my legs felt like lead. I pulled out my phone and texted Mia, fingers trembling. He's out there again. I'm following him. Don't come. The reply was almost instant. Be careful. Don't get caught up. I'm here whenever you need. I pocketed the phone and exhaled slowly, trying to clear my head. I couldn't keep living like this, trailing shadows, guessing at intentions. But I also couldn't stop. Something about this felt like a trap I'd already walked into, and every step forward only pulled me deeper. I found a crowded street and lost him in the flow of people. The city swallowed him up, and for the first time in days, I felt a tentative flicker of relief. But that night, when I returned home, the sense of danger didn't dissipate. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and drew the curtains tight against the dark. The apartment felt smaller somehow, more vulnerable. I set the camera on the kitchen table and sat down, the silence around me thick and suffocating. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You're making this worse. I stared at the screen, feeling the blood drain from my face. The message was short, cold, and unmistakably clear. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Mia. Her voice on the line was steady and calm, a lifeline in the gathering darkness. We're going to figure this out, she said. Together. For a moment, the dread loosened its grip. Maybe this wasn't just me losing control. Maybe, finally, I wasn't alone. But deep down, I knew the game had changed. The watchers weren't just lurking anymore, they were playing, and this time, the stakes felt dangerously real. Story 2, Apartment 3B. It started like any other day. I woke up to the usual gray light filtering through the blinds, the hum of the heater clicking on in the corner of the room, and the distant murmur of traffic outside my third-floor apartment window. I had planned to spend the morning catching up on work, but first, I wanted coffee, something to pull me out of the fog that never quite lifted on Monday mornings. The coffee shop below my building opened at 7, and by the time I got downstairs, the line was short, just a few regulars chatting softly. I recognized the barista, a young woman with a sleeveless tattoo peeking from beneath her apron. Her name tag read Maya. She smiled when she saw me and asked if I wanted my usual. I nodded, and she busied herself with my order. The place smelled familiar, a mix of roasted beans and the faint sweetness of vanilla syrup. As I waited, I noticed a man sitting alone near the window. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with a thin gray beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't reading a newspaper or looking at a phone, just staring out the window with a tense expression, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of his mug. I felt a flicker of unease but shrugged it off. People can look serious for any number of reasons. I took my coffee and stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind that hinted at the coming spring but still held winter's chill. I walked toward the subway entrance, sipping my drink, and glanced back once. The man was still there, unchanged. I told myself to stop noticing him. It was probably nothing. The day passed in its usual blur. Meetings, emails, the drone of the office. But around 3 in the afternoon, I got a text from my neighbor, Sarah, in the apartment beside mine. "Hey, did you see anyone hanging around near the building this morning? There was a guy just standing by the door for a while." I paused. "No, not really." "Why?" She replied quickly. "He looked kind of off. Just stood there staring at the entrance but didn't go in or anything. Creepy vibe." I typed a quick response, trying not to sound worried. "I saw someone sitting in the coffee shop across the street, maybe the same guy." Sarah sent back a thumbs up emoji. "Maybe. Just keep an eye out, okay?" I agreed, though I didn't want to admit I was already uneasy. That evening, I left work a bit earlier than usual. The city was quieter, the sidewalks less crowded. As I walked up to my building, I noticed the same man from the coffee shop standing just a few feet from the entrance. He wasn't wearing the baseball cap now, his hair was thinning and disheveled, and his eyes darted nervously between the street and the doorway. He didn't acknowledge me as I passed. I fumbled with my keys, feeling my hand shake slightly. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and checked the peephole. The man was still outside, leaning against the wall, looking down at the pavement. I called Sarah. She answered after 2 rings and immediately asked if I was okay. I said yes, but my voice was tighter than I intended. "Did you see him?" she asked. "Yeah. Right outside." "Seriously, maybe we should call the building manager or something." I promised I'd keep an eye out but didn't want to escalate too quickly. After all, it was just one man, and there was no clear reason to suspect anything criminal. Still, my mind churned with questions. Why was he here? Was he watching me? Was this just a coincidence? I double-checked the deadbolt and the chain on my door, then moved to the window and closed the blinds. The streetlights outside cast long shadows, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure move, but when I blinked, there was nothing. I told myself to stop being paranoid. Later, I tried to distract myself by watching a comedy show, but every laugh track felt hollow. The silence between scenes was too loud, filled with the sense that I was being observed. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping on my window. My heart jumped into my throat. I told myself it was probably a tree branch or some stray noise, but the tapping came again, slow and deliberate. I turned on every light and pulled the curtains tightly shut. Sleep came only after hours of tossing and turning. The next morning, a note was slipped under my door. It was folded, the edges worn and stained. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. "Nice place you have here," it read, in messy, hurried handwriting. I didn't know what to feel first: fear, anger, confusion. I showed it to Sarah, who immediately insisted we go to the police. I hesitated but agreed. The officer we spoke to was patient but firm. He asked if I had any idea who might have left the note or any recent conflicts. I shook my head. My life was uneventful, mostly filled with work and the occasional drink with friends. He promised increased patrols near the building and suggested I install a security camera. He also gave me a card, telling me to call if anything else happened. After he left, Sarah and I sat in my living room, the note on the coffee table between us. Neither of us wanted to admit how shaken we were. The man was gone when I checked outside later that day. No sign of him anywhere. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The day after the note, I woke up feeling hollow, like I was carrying a weight I couldn't see but that pressed down on my chest. The usual noise of the city filtered through my closed window, but it sounded distant, muted somehow, as if I was underwater. I forced myself out of bed and made coffee, the bitter taste grounding me for a moment. Sarah texted early, checking in. "You okay? I'm coming over later to help you figure out what to do next." I appreciated the offer but wasn't sure what next looked like. The police had promised patrols, but beyond that, I felt exposed. I didn't want to be a burden to Sarah, though I knew I needed someone. I replied with a tired thanks, "I'll see you this evening." Work was a blur. I half listened during meetings, my attention drifting to the little noises in my apartment, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the building settling, distant footsteps in the hallway. I kept imagining the man's eyes, the way they seemed to pierce through me in the coffee shop, the way they followed me when I left. But when I looked outside, the street was empty, calm. Around noon, I went out for lunch, hoping the change of scenery would help. I chose a small sandwich shop 2 blocks from my building, one I'd never visited before. The place was cramped, with a few booths and a counter lined with jars of pickles and homemade sauces. The woman behind the counter was older, with silver hair pulled back loosely, and she smiled warmly as I ordered. "Busy morning?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She shrugged. "Same as always, I guess. Little things here and there." As I sat down with my sandwich, I noticed a man sitting alone at the booth across from me. He was middle-aged, wearing a leather jacket that looked worn but cared for. His hands rested on the table, fingers twitching slightly. He wasn't looking at his phone or reading anything, just staring straight ahead, almost blankly. I felt the familiar prickling at the back of my neck. I told myself to shake it off, people get lost in thought all the time. But then his head snapped sharply to the side, eyes locking onto mine for a few seconds. I looked away quickly, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. I finished my lunch in a hurry and stepped outside. The air was crisp, with a faint smell of rain lingering. On the walk back, I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me, but no one was there. When I reached my building, the lobby was empty except for the janitor, a short man with a mop slung over his shoulder. I greeted him, and he nodded in return without much expression. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, moving quickly but not so fast as to be obvious. The last thing I wanted was to show how rattled I was. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and double-checked it before moving to the window. Outside, nothing stirred. No figures, no shadows, just the faint glow of streetlights and the occasional car driving by. I tried to get back to work, but the note and the man's presence gnawed at me. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Can you come downstairs? I think there's someone outside. I don't want to be alone." I grabbed my coat and keys and hurried downstairs, my heart pounding harder than it had in days. At the entrance, Sarah stood just inside the lobby doors, her eyes wide and her voice low. "There's a guy hanging around out there. He's been standing by the steps for about 20 minutes. I looked outside. A man leaned against the railing, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wore a hoodie pulled low over his face, but even with the dim light, I could tell he was watching the building. "Should we call the police?" I whispered. Sarah hesitated. "Maybe. But what if he leaves before they get here? What if he's just waiting for someone?" I nodded, pulling out my phone and dialing the non-emergency line. The operator was polite but slow to respond, asking for details and our exact location. As we spoke, the man shifted, lifting his head and glancing around nervously. His movements were deliberate but tense. After a few minutes, the dispatcher assured us officers were on their way. We stayed near the door, watching the man, who had now started pacing along the sidewalk, his steps quick and erratic. When the police arrived, 2 officers stepped out of their car, flashlights in hand. The man saw them and bolted down the street, disappearing around a corner before they could reach him. One officer turned to us. "Did you get a look at him?" Sarah described the hoodie and the way he moved. I added details about the man from the coffee shop and the sandwich place, wondering if it was the same person or if there were multiple strangers watching me. The officers promised to increase patrols and suggested I keep my doors locked and avoid going out alone at night. They also encouraged me to install more security measures, like cameras and better locks. After they left, Sarah and I sat in the lobby for a while. Neither of us said much, the tension hanging heavy between us. Later that night, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the building, the creaks, the distant footsteps, the occasional cough from someone in another apartment. The city outside was alive, vibrant, but I felt like I was shrinking inside myself, trapped by a growing unease I couldn't explain. Just before I finally drifted off, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number: "You can't hide forever." I stared at the screen, heart racing. The words were simple, but their meaning jagged and sharp. I called Sarah immediately. She answered on the first ring, her voice steady but low. "I got it, too," I said. She sighed. "We need to do something. This can't keep going." "I know," I replied, swallowing hard. "But what?" For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of what was happening settling around us like a storm about to break. I glanced out the window at the silent street, wondering how long it would be before the next message, the next visit, the next sign that this, whatever this was far from over. The next morning, I woke up with a lingering heaviness in my chest. The city outside was already stirring, but inside my apartment, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I stared at my phone for a long time before finally unlocking it to find nothing new, no messages, no missed calls, no alerts. For a moment, that absence felt like a reprieve, but the quiet was uneasy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sarah arrived around noon, just as I was finishing a cup of coffee. She had that same determined look in her eyes, the one that made me both grateful and more anxious at the same time. "I called the building manager," she said without preamble as soon as she stepped inside. "He's agreed to install a few security cameras around the entrances and in the lobby. Should be done by the end of the week." I nodded, swallowing the knot forming in my throat. "Did you tell him about the messages?" "Yeah. He said he'd keep an eye out for any suspicious activity, but you know how these things go. They can't watch all the time." We spent the afternoon poring over the messages together, Sarah scrolling through the thread on my phone while I tried to focus on anything else, my laptop, the dull news playing quietly on TV, the clock ticking on the wall. But the messages gnawed at the edges of my mind, like a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. Later, I decided to take a walk. Not because I felt safe, but because sitting inside felt like suffocating. I left the apartment with my coat pulled tightly around me and my phone clutched like a lifeline. The streets were busier than usual, people rushing to appointments, kids laughing on their way to school, the usual rhythms of the city that somehow felt alien to me. As I passed the coffee shop, I stopped for a moment and glanced inside. The barista, Maya, was behind the counter, chatting with a couple of regulars. The man from the first day, the one in the baseball cap and gray beard, was nowhere to be seen. I told myself not to look for him, that he was probably gone for good. But as I moved on, I caught a glimpse of someone standing just across the street. At first, I thought it was a passerby, but then I slowed, feeling that familiar creeping sense of being watched. The figure was partially obscured in the shadows, but the outline was unmistakably male. He didn't move or make any noise, just stood there, facing my direction. I crossed the street quickly, my heart pounding louder than the cars passing by. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Back inside my apartment, I locked the door and double-checked it as if the action alone could keep danger out. The hours crawled by. I told myself I was imagining things, that paranoia was twisting ordinary moments into threats. But then my phone buzzed again. A new message from the same unknown number: "Saw you today." The simplicity of the sentence sent a cold rush through me. I almost dropped the phone. My fingers trembled as I texted back, hesitating before finally typing, "Who is this?" No reply. I called Sarah immediately, but she didn't answer. I left a voicemail, asking her to call me back as soon as she could. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous pacing and half-hearted attempts to work. Every noise in the building, the creak of the pipes, footsteps in the hallway, the rustling of paper somewhere down the hall, set my nerves on edge. I found myself checking the peephole more times than I could count. No one was there, but that didn't make me feel any safer. That evening, the building felt emptier than usual. I thought about going down to the lobby to see if the janitor was around, but the thought of being alone in the common areas made me hesitate. Instead, I sat near the window, blinds partially open, watching the street below. It was then I noticed something else: two men, standing a few doors down, their faces partly hidden under the brims of their hats. They weren't talking much, but there was a tension in their posture, the way they shifted their weight from one foot to the other, their eyes scanning the street and the building. I ducked away from the window, heart racing. The feeling of being watched had escalated into something more palpable, more suffocating. Minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time, a picture. It was taken from a distance, blurry but unmistakably me, standing by the window, looking out. I sat frozen in disbelief. Someone had been outside, watching my apartment, and now they knew I knew. The sound of a knock on the door shattered the silence before I could even think about my next move. It was soft, deliberate. I didn't recognize the rhythm. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't open it. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering the address and the situation. The operator was calm but urgent, promising officers would be dispatched immediately. I sat down on the floor, backs against the door, phone pressed tightly to my ear. The knocking continued, persistent but not forceful, like someone testing boundaries. Then it stopped. Minutes passed. The police arrived soon after. The first officer knocked firmly and identified himself. I opened the door cautiously, relief flooding through me. They swept the hallway in the front of the building but found no one. One of the officers stayed behind while the other went to check the immediate neighborhood. They suggested I stay somewhere else for the night if I could, but even Sarah's apartment felt too close. The officer who stayed with me told me about recent break-ins in the area, about how sometimes people just try to intimidate others without clear motive, driven by their own demons or desperation. "Not all threats make sense," he said quietly. I nodded, exhausted, feeling more exposed than ever. Later, Sarah finally called back. Her voice was soft but resolute. "I'm coming over. We'll figure this out together." When she arrived, the weight in my chest lifted just a little. Not because anything had changed, but because I wasn't alone. We sat in the dim light of my living room, the blinds closed tight this time, phones in hand, waiting. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the small battle unfolding inside that apartment. But I knew this was far from over. And whatever was coming next, it was getting closer. The morning light came weak and gray, filtering through the blinds in a way that made the apartment feel colder than it was. I lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling the weight of last night settle deep in my chest. Sarah was still here, asleep on the couch, one arm flung over her face. Her presence was a comfort, but it also made the silence feel more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I reached for my phone, half expecting another message. Nothing. No texts, no missed calls, no notifications. The quiet was almost unbearable. I got up, pacing the small living room, listening to the creaks and sighs of the building. Outside, traffic hummed softly, a city moving on without care. I wanted to believe that, to feel some distance from whatever was happening, but the doubt gnawed at me. I decided to open the window just a crack, enough to let some fresh air in. The chill seeped through, and with it came the familiar mix of exhaust fumes, wet pavement, and the faint scent of trash. The street looked normal enough, cars parked neatly along the curb, a few people walking dogs or getting coffee. Nothing out of place, at least not at first glance. Still, I found myself scanning the sidewalks, the faces, the corners where shadows gathered. But no one was watching. At least not right now. Sarah stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Just tired." She got up and stretched, heading to the kitchen. "I'm going to grab some breakfast. Want anything?" I shook my head but followed her, the normalcy of making coffee and toast a small anchor. We ate quietly, the clinking of dishes and the hum of the fridge filling the space between us. After breakfast, Sarah said, I called a locksmith. He's coming in a couple of hours to install better locks and reinforce the door. Maybe some window bars too, if you're okay with that. I hesitated. The thought of bars on the window felt like admitting defeat, like turning my home into a fortress. But I nodded. Yeah. To what you think is best. She smiled briefly, a mixture of relief and worry. Good. We'll take every precaution. The locksmith arrived sooner than expected. He was a stocky man, probably in his 40s, with a calm demeanor and quick, efficient hands. As he worked on the door, tightening the deadbolt and replacing the old lock with something heavier, I watched, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and vulnerability. Looks solid, he said, testing the lock with a caring. But you might want to think about a peephole camera or something. It's the best way to know who's lingering outside. I nodded slowly. Yeah. It's on the list. He glanced up, suddenly serious. This kind of thing happens more than you'd think. People get targeted for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes it's more personal. You've got to stay vigilant. I swallowed hard, the words sinking in. I have. After he left, Sarah and I sat down to talk again, trying to map out the next steps. We made plans to install cameras in the lobby and outside the building entrance, and I promised to be more careful about when I left the apartment, trying to stick to busier times. Still, the fear lingered, like a shadow just beyond the edge of sight. That afternoon, I forced myself to go out for a walk, this time with Sarah. We took a different route, one that took us through a small park a few blocks away. The sun had come up briefly, casting harsh light on wet leaves and muddy paths. The change in scenery helped, if only a little. We talked about everything and nothing: work, the news, old movies we liked, and for a moment, the tension in my chest eased. But then I noticed a man sitting on a bench a short distance away. He was older, wearing a dark coat and a cap pulled low over his eyes, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He watched us with a slow, almost deliberate gaze. I felt that same prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the one that had become so familiar lately. I glanced at Sarah, who noticed too. Without a word, we turned and walked faster, keeping our eyes peeled, but when we looked back once, the man was gone. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a coincidence, that I was hyper-aware after everything that had happened. But the truth was, I was exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally. That evening, back in the apartment, I tried to distract myself with a book, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. The blinds were still drawn, but the city lights filtered through, painting long streaks across the floor. I heard a noise, a soft tapping, like last time, but quieter, almost hesitant. My heart jumped, and I froze, waiting. Nothing followed. I told myself it was the wind or a bird or some random sound. Still, I checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. Later, Sarah and I sat on the couch, phones lying between us. Neither of us wanted to check them, but when my phone buzzed, I couldn't resist. A new message from the same unknown number. You're getting smarter. The words hit me like a punch. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. What did that mean? Was someone watching my every move, tracking what I was doing? Sarah reached out and took my phone gently. Have you told the police again? She asked. I nodded. They said they'll keep patrolling more frequently. But what? I don't think it's enough. Whoever this is knows the building, knows when people come and go. They're testing me. She squeezed my hand. Then we keep fighting. Together. We spent the rest of the night planning, making lists of safety measures, neighbors to check in with, places I could stay if I needed to get out fast. We agreed to be extra cautious, to watch for anything unusual. By the time Sarah left, the apartment felt emptier than before, but also less lonely. I locked the door behind her, double-checked the chain, and sat down near the window, the phone resting heavily in my lap. Outside, the city breathed on, indifferent. Inside, I knew the game had changed. This wasn't just someone passing through. They were here, and they weren't done yet. I woke up to the feeling of the phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand, the buzzing persistent enough to drag me out of a restless sleep. For a moment, I was disoriented, the heavy weight in my chest from the past week still settling in. My heart was already racing before I even looked at the screen. Another message from that unknown number. I sat up slowly, careful not to knock over the glass of water beside me. The message was short and sharp. Why won't you answer? There was no timestamp, but I knew it had come in the last few minutes. I didn't respond. I didn't want to encourage whoever was on the other end. It was too early, too quiet, and already too terrifying. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and stared at the ceiling, willing my thoughts to slow down. The apartment was still dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Outside, the city was beginning to stir, distant sirens and the low hum of traffic already filling the morning air. But inside, I felt trapped, caught in a bubble of paranoia and fear. For a few minutes, I stayed there, staring into the dark, before finally dragging myself out of bed. I glanced at the clock, 5:45. Too early to call Sarah. I didn't want to disturb her, not yet. I needed to figure out what to do next. The day passed in a blur of half-measured routines. I made coffee, tried to eat breakfast, and sat in front of my laptop, pretending to work. But every noise, the creak of the floorboards, the distant voices in the hallway, the faint thud of something hitting the trash chute set my nerves on edge. I found myself flinching at every knock or ring at the door, though no one ever came. Sarah texted mid-morning, thinking about stopping by later. Want me to bring coffee? I replied with a simple yes, grateful for the company but wary of the growing tension they'd both share. When she arrived just after noon, she looked tired but determined. She didn't ask about the messages or the nights. Instead, she sat down across from me with her usual calm, and we talked about practical things, changing locks, more cameras, talking to neighbors. The building manager had agreed to the upgrades, including a better intercom system with a video feed. It felt like progress, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to step outside. I told Sarah I needed fresh air, though the idea of being outside alone was daunting. She nodded and said she'd stay in the apartment, offering to call if I needed her. The corridor felt longer than usual as I locked my door behind me, an almost ritualistic act now, and headed toward the stairs. I took the back exit, which led to a narrow alley behind the building. It was quieter than the front street, lined with dumpsters and recycling bins, the smell sharp and unpleasant. I walked briskly, not wanting to linger, but something caught my eye. A man was leaning against the wall near the alley entrance, his posture casual but unsettling. He looked younger than the man I'd seen at the coffee shop and the park bench, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair and a leather jacket. He didn't acknowledge me as I passed, but his eyes followed me, sharp and calculating. I swallowed hard and quickened my pace, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. As I reached the street, I glanced back. He was still there, watching, silent. I pulled my phone out, fingers trembling. The screen was dark, but I knew I needed to call Sarah. I texted her, "There's someone outside the back door. I'm heading back now." Her reply was almost immediate, "I'm locking everything up. Call me when you get in." I moved faster, the city noise dimming in my ears, the world shrinking to the narrow path ahead and the pounding of my heart. When I reached the building's front entrance, I slipped inside and locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt and chain with trembling hands. The lobby was empty. No janitor, no neighbors, just silence. The building felt colder, emptier, less safe than ever. I fumbled toward the stairs, feet shaking, and hurried up to my apartment. Once inside, I locked the door, checked all the windows, and drew the blinds tightly shut. Sarah called immediately. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice steady but concerned. "I'm inside," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Good. I'm coming up." 10 minutes later, she was there, her presence a small island of safety. We sat together in the living room, the lamps casting a warm glow over the room, the blinds shut tight against the outside world. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number, "You saw him." I looked at Sarah, who nodded grimly. "They're watching you more closely now." I didn't respond. We talked for a long time about safety, about next steps, about what to do if things escalated. Sarah suggested I stay somewhere else for a few nights, maybe with a friend or family outside the city, just to get some distance. But I hesitated. Leaving felt like admitting defeat, letting the person outside win. Later that night, I sat near the window with the blinds half open, watching the street below, heart pounding every time a shadow shifted or a figure passed. I kept my phone close, ready to call for help. The city felt alive and indifferent, but inside my apartment, the tension was tangible. Hours later, just past midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. They stopped outside my door. I froze. A soft tapping followed, 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 more. The same pattern as before, but this time, closer, more urgent. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address and the situation. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline, promising help was on the way. The tapping stopped. Minutes later, I heard voices in the hallway, footsteps moving away. I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me, but it was fragile, tentative. The threat was still out there, watching, waiting. And I knew this was only the beginning. Story 3, The Watcher in Room 5. I never thought the early morning jog would become something I dreaded. It had started as a way to clear my head after long days at the office, a ritual to shake off the heavy weight of deadlines and meetings. The neighborhood around my apartment was usually quiet in the mornings, the streets empty except for the occasional dog walker or a mail carrier. I kept my headphones off most days, preferring the sound of my own breath and footsteps. It helped me focus. That Tuesday morning was no different as I laced up my sneakers and stepped outside, the sun just starting to peek through the clouds. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and the lingering scent of early spring blooms from someone's garden. I noticed a man standing near the corner of Maple and 7th, just outside the convenience store that hadn't yet opened. He was wearing a dark jacket, pulled up tight around his neck, and a baseball cap that shadowed most of his face. I didn't think much of it at first. People often loitered there, waiting for the store to open or meeting friends before work. But there was something about how he stayed perfectly still, staring down the street as if watching for something, that tugged at my attention. I kept my pace steady, telling myself not to overthink it. About halfway through my usual route, just past the small park with the rusty swings, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just another jogger or a dog walker catching up, but the rhythm was too irregular, too heavy. I glanced over my shoulder without breaking stride, but no one was there. I slowed down slightly, trying to make out anything ahead or behind me, but the street was empty save for the occasional parked car and the flicker of newsprint stuck to a storm drain. I tried to shake the unease and picked up speed again, but the feeling lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. When I turned onto Pine Street, the neighborhood grew denser, rows of old brick houses with peeling paint and overgrown shrubs. I liked this part of the route because it felt quieter, more secluded. But that morning, the quiet was different. The windows of the houses were dark, no one waving from porches or opening doors. I passed one house where the front gate was half open, the latch hanging loose, scraping softly against the metal fence as a breeze rustled some dried leaves. I paused briefly to close it, partly out of habit, partly because it felt wrong to leave it that way. Just as I bent down, I caught a glimpse of something, a face, peeking from behind the side of the house across the street. It was quick, almost too fast to be sure, but the flash of eyes and the tense line of a mouth held my gaze for a moment before disappearing. I stood up straight, scanning the area, but there was no one visible now. My heart sped up, but I told myself it must have been a neighbor stepping out to hang laundry or a kid playing hide-and-seek. Still, I glanced down the street and noticed a figure standing near a lamppost, half cloaked in shadow. The person wasn't moving, just watching. I kept moving, faster now, the rhythm of my footsteps louder against the cracked pavement. My breath was shallow, my mind racing through possibilities, maybe someone waiting for a bus, a jogger ahead who had stopped. But every time I looked back, the street was empty. When I reached the corner where I usually turn around, I noticed a man from the convenience store again. He was closer now, just beyond the intersection, his head tilting in my direction as if following me. I stopped and stared, but he turned and walked away, his footsteps soft on the wet ground. Relief washed over me in that moment. Maybe it was paranoia after all. I decided to cut the run short and head back, eager to leave the strange feeling behind. As I retraced my steps, I noticed small details that hadn't been there before or that I had simply ignored. A black backpack left abandoned on a bench in the park, a bicycle leaning against a tree with its front wheel twisted at an odd angle, a crumpled newspaper wedged between the branches of a bush. Nothing overtly threatening, but each seemed out of place, like pieces of someone else's story scattered unevenly across my familiar path. When I reached my building, I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking more than I realized. The door was unlocked, even though I was sure I'd locked it the night before. I paused, listening for any sounds inside the lobby. None. The elevator dinged softly as I pressed the button, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 5th floor. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, then steadied, casting a harsh, sterile glow. Inside my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to slow my racing heartbeat. I checked my phone, scrolling through messages, trying to distract myself, but the unease lingered. The man, the face across the street, the empty streets, it all felt connected, like the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. Later that afternoon, I found a note slipped under my door. It was a small piece of torn notebook paper with a single line scrawled in shaky handwriting, "I see you." I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a prank. Someone playing a joke, maybe a neighbor with too much time on their hands. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The warning, however vague, marked a line I didn't want to cross. I called the building manager and asked if anyone else had reported anything strange. He was vague in response, said some tenants had complained about strangers lurking around at odd hours, but dismissed it as kids hanging out or harmless drunks. He promised to keep an eye out, but didn't sound convinced there was a real problem. That night, I double-locked my door and checked every window 3 times before going to bed. I left a light on in the hallway outside my apartment, and for the first time in months, I left my phone on the nightstand, just in case. Sleep was fitful. Every creak and groan of the old building jolted me awake. I kept imagining shadows moving just beyond the edge of the light, feeling eyes on me even in the dark. By morning, the note was gone. No idea who took it, or why. A brief relief settled in, but the tension didn't fade. Whoever had left it was still out there. Somewhere close. And that was the worst part, knowing that the normal, familiar streets I'd walked 1,000 times were no longer safe. Not really. Not anymore. The next morning, the air felt thicker, heavier, like the city itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to jog, but I also didn't want to let the fear win by staying inside all day. So, I went through the motions, woke up early, changed into my running clothes, double-checked the door locks, and stepped outside. The sky was overcast, the kind of dull gray that flattens everything and makes colors fade into the background. The neighborhood looked normal enough, but I found myself scanning every corner, every shadow, with new suspicion. The man from the convenience store wasn't there, which should have been comforting, but instead it left a strange gap. It was like a missing piece that I was expecting to find, and when it wasn't there, it made the whole scene feel off-kilter. I started my run, deliberately sticking to the streets I knew best, avoiding the dense row of brick houses where I'd seen the face the day before. The streets seemed quieter than usual, fewer people out walking dogs or fetching their morning coffee. Even the usual hum of distant traffic sounded muted. About 10 minutes in, I reached the park bench where I'd noticed the abandoned backpack the day before. It was still there, but now it was zipped shut, neatly placed on the bench as if someone had returned to retrieve it and then changed their mind. I glanced around, but no one was nearby. A trash can was knocked over a few feet away, but no wind stirred the scattered papers and plastic cups. Nothing out of place, only the subtle unease of a space that felt watched. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. For a moment, I let the routine wash over me. This was just a jog. Routine. But then I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing across the street, partially hidden behind a parked car. At first, I thought it was someone waiting for a bus, but the figure didn't shift or look away as I passed. They stayed still, watching. I stopped suddenly, heart thudding. The figure pulled back into the shadows of a narrow alleyway, disappearing before I could get a good look. I shook my head, telling myself to keep moving. But the weight in my chest didn't lift. I turned the corner at Maple and 7th, hoping to put some distance between me and whoever was following, but the street was empty, eerily so. I didn't see the man from the previous morning, but I found myself checking every reflective surface, every window as I ran. I got the sense I was being watched, tracked. The city's normal rhythms felt broken. On an impulse, I stopped outside a coffee shop with large windows, and I looked inside. A few early customers sat at tables, but no one paid me any attention. I studied their faces, none of them looked familiar, and none were watching me. It was a small comfort, but it didn't last. As I turned to leave, I noticed something taped to the inside of the door, a handwritten note, the paper yellowed at the edges. I stepped closer and read the words, written in the same shaky handwriting as the previous note, "You shouldn't have seen me." My fingers trembled as I tore the note from the glass and stuffed it into my pocket. The rest of the run was a blur. I kept my head down, cut the route short, and headed back to my apartment. Each step felt heavier, like I was carrying the weight of the notes with me. When I got inside, I locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and sat down on my couch, trying to make sense of what was happening. I called the building manager again, more urgently this time, hoping for answers or at least some reassurance. He told me security cameras had been installed near the convenience store recently because of some petty thefts, but none that matched anything like what I described. No one had reported suspicious behavior matching the notes or the figures I'd seen. He suggested I stay alert but avoid confrontation, and said he'd check the building's security footage if I wanted. I agreed, and later that afternoon, he called me back. The footage was grainy and mostly showed empty streets or passers-by, but there was one disturbing moment, a figure wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap standing still for several minutes near the convenience store, looking directly at the camera. The timestamp matched the time I first saw the man. The manager said the identity was unrecognizable, and no one had come forward to claim the jacket or report a missing item. He promised to increase patrols around the building at night. That evening, I stayed in, leaving a lamp on in the living room and keeping my phone within arm's reach. The city's usual night noises, distant sirens, barking dogs, the hum of passing cars were there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong just beyond the windows. The hallway light outside my door flickered twice, once sharply, then dimmed again. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside my door. I held my breath, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps didn't move on. They stayed there for a long moment, then retreated down the hall. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to breathe. I didn't sleep well. Every creak and groan of the old building felt magnified in the silence. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, barely audible, carried through the thin walls. I strained to listen, but it stopped before I could make out any words. By morning, I felt exhausted but strangely relieved. No new notes, no figures lurking outside. Maybe the footsteps were just the building settling or someone else's late-night wanderings. Maybe it was nothing. But the sense of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had grown heavier, like a storm cloud hanging just out of sight, waiting to break. I knew I couldn't ignore it, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could. The safe streets I once took for granted had become a maze of shadows and unanswered questions. And somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting for the moment I couldn't look away. That morning, I woke up feeling the usual tightness in my chest, the residue of the previous night's anxiety settling stubbornly into my thoughts. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner struggling to keep up with the rising temperature outside. It was the kind of stillness that made every creak and scrape in the building seem louder than it should be. I forced myself to get out of bed and started the day like any other, trying to impose some order on the creeping chaos. I made coffee, poured it into my favorite mug, and sat by the window watching the street below. A few neighbors were already out, walking dogs or unloading groceries from cars. It looked normal. Maybe too normal. I kept scanning the sidewalk, half expecting to see that dark-jacketed man lurking in the distance or someone disappearing abruptly around a corner. But no one appeared. By mid-morning, I forced myself to go out for a walk. I knew staying inside wasn't going to help. The apartment felt like a cage, and the walls carried the weight of my growing paranoia. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and left the building, locking the door behind me with deliberate care. The neighborhood looked unchanged, at least on the surface. The convenience store was open now, a little bell chiming as customers came and went. But the man from the previous days was nowhere to be seen. I walked slowly, deliberately avoiding the usual jogging route that had become a minefield in my mind. Instead, I headed toward the small cafe at the corner of Elm and 8th, a place I'd passed countless times but never stopped at. Inside, the cafe was warm and smelled of fresh pastries and ground coffee. A handful of people sat reading newspapers or tapping away at laptops. The barista gave me a quick smile when I ordered, and I took a seat by the window, trying to ground myself in the ordinary. But even here, something felt off. My gaze flicked repeatedly to the door, half expecting it to swing open with the sudden arrival of someone I recognized from the shadows outside. I noticed a man sitting alone at a table near the back, his head down but clearly watching the room. He wasn't looking at me specifically, but his presence felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it and focused on the steam rising from my coffee. For a moment, the normalcy was comforting. People went about their routines, the clatter of cups and conversation filling the space. But when I glanced back toward the door, the man was gone. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck and turned toward the street through the window. Across the way, an older woman walked a small poodle, her gaze flicking up and down the block as if she too sensed something wrong. Then I caught sight of a figure crossing the street and heading into the alley next to the cafe, the same alley where the figure had disappeared the day before. I hesitated but decided to follow. Something in me needed answers, even if it meant walking into discomfort. The alley was narrow and smelled faintly of garbage and damp brick. It was the kind of place people hurried through without looking around. I kept my phone out, the screen lit, pretending to check messages while I crept forward. At the alley's entrance, I spotted a discarded soda can crushed against the wall, and a few steps in, a cigarette but still smoldering faintly on the cracked pavement. Fresh. Halfway down, I saw it, a thin scrap of paper wedged under a loose brick in the wall. I bent to retrieve it carefully, unfolding it to reveal another note, this time typed on a small slip from some printer. "Stop looking." I swallowed hard, a bitter taste rising in my throat. The handwriting, or in this case, the font, felt clinical, devoid of the shaky desperation of the earlier notes. This was different, more calculated. The alley seemed to close in around me. I could hear the distant hum of traffic and the faint echoes of a car door slamming several blocks away. The sound made me jump more than it should have. I stuffed the note into my pocket and hurried back onto the main street. As I walked, I became hyper-aware of every sound behind me, the shuffle of footsteps, the clink of glass, the whisper of fabric brushing against pavement. Every time I glanced back, there was nothing but empty street. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, a shadow I couldn't shake. I decided to call the building manager again when I got home. Maybe there was something I didn't know, someone else who had noticed unusual activity. But when I reached his voicemail, I left a terse message, saying I'd call back later. Later that day, I tried to distract myself by cleaning the apartment, but every noise from the hallway made me jump. I locked the door 3 times and double-checked the windows. When I looked out the window facing the street, I saw the familiar black backpack sitting on the park bench again. It wasn't zipped shut this time. There was no one nearby. I debated going down to check but forced myself to stay put. I didn't want to be bait. Around dusk, I heard a knock on the door. My heart pounded as I approached slowly, peering through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door cautiously, but the hallway was empty. Just then, a folded piece of paper slid under the door. I hesitated, then picked it up. The note was brief, last chance. Panic swelled, and I dropped the paper on the floor, pressing my back against the door. Every instinct screamed to call the police, but I hesitated. There was no direct threat, only a mounting series of warnings. I spent the night in a restless state, listening for any sounds beyond the normal footsteps in the hall, the click of keys, the faint murmur of voices. But nothing came. The next morning, I made a decision. I would not go out alone anymore, not until I could figure out what was happening. I asked a coworker if she could walk with me on my next run, and she agreed without hesitation. At least, I thought, I wouldn't be facing this alone. The city outside carried on, indifferent to the small disruptions unfolding within its streets. But for me, The invisible thread tying these moments together was tightening, drawing me into a shadowed game I hadn't asked to play. The ordinary had slipped away. The watcher was still out there, patient and unseen. And I knew the next move was mine. The morning started like any other, but I didn't dare step outside for my usual jog. Instead, I sat by the window with my coffee, watching the street below with a nervous vigilance that had become second nature. The city looked ordinary, people hurrying to work, a delivery van pulling up, a woman pushing a stroller, but every face seemed like a potential threat, every glance a calculated move. I kept my phone close, the notes and messages from the past days still fresh in my mind. Around mid-morning, my coworker Emma showed up as planned. I told her bits and pieces about what I'd been experiencing, careful not to overwhelm her, but enough to convince her this wasn't just paranoia. She wore a light jacket despite the spring warmth, and her expression was steady, calm, something I desperately needed. We agreed to walk together after work, to retrace my jogging route, and maybe figure out who or what was behind the notes. The hours crawled by, each minute marked by the occasional ping from my phone or the distant drone of traffic. I stared at the screen, half expecting another note or message, but nothing came. The building manager hadn't called back, and the streets seemed uneventful. Still, the tension wrapped around me like a tight band, squeezing my chest whenever I thought I'd relax. When Emma arrived in the late afternoon, I couldn't help but notice the way she scanned the hall before stepping inside. She carried a large handbag that looked heavy, and she had a set of keys in one hand, jangling a little as she walked. I wondered if she felt as uneasy as I did. We left the building together just before sunset, the sky a dull pink gray, the kind of light that blurs edges and softens shadows. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but not quite ready to admit it. Emma kept up a steady stream of casual conversation, asking about the office's new project, a few mundane questions that helped distract me. We started down the street, stepping over cracked sidewalks and patches of stubborn grass that pushed through the asphalt. Our route took us past the convenience store on the corner. The door was propped open for ventilation, and the sound of a radio came faintly from inside. I scanned the block, half expecting to see the man in the dark jacket or someone else lurking, but the street was empty. No one watching, no one waiting. I relaxed slightly, inhaling the crisp spring air. But as we passed the park bench where the black backpack had frequently appeared, I froze. The backpack was gone, vanished without a trace. The bench was clean, no crumbs or stains, just a few scattered leaves blowing in the light breeze. Maybe someone finally took it, I said, forcing a casual tone. Emma nodded, her eyes moving quickly around the street. We walked a little farther, turning onto Pine Street, the neighborhood growing quieter, the houses older, their paint peeling in the fading light. I noticed the half-open gate again, the latch swinging softly against the metal fence, just like before. Emma stopped and closed it firmly. The sound echoed in the stillness, louder than it should have. Then I saw it, a flash of movement from the corner of my eye. A man stepped out from behind a parked car a few yards ahead. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his head, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets. His face was obscured in shadow, but there was something about the way he stood that set my nerves jangling, too casual, too deliberate. Emma's hand tightened around mine. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I nodded, heart pounding. "He's been here. I'm sure of it." The man took a step forward, then stopped, glancing down the street. I felt his gaze brush past us, like a light graze, but when I looked directly at him, he didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he turned and disappeared down a narrow alley between two houses. We exchanged a glance, the silent acknowledgement that this wasn't random or accidental. We kept walking, but the energy shifted, the air thickening with unspoken tension. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustling of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the clack of our shoes on the pavement. I found myself glancing behind constantly, half expecting to see the man emerging again. When we reached the corner where I usually turned around during my runs, Emma stopped. "Maybe we should head back," she said softly. I wanted to insist on pressing forward, on confronting whatever this was, but my body shook with exhaustion and fear. "Yeah," I agreed. "Let's go." The walk back was quiet, punctuated only by the occasional car passing and the rustle of wind through the trees. I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call for help if needed, though I wasn't sure who I would call for exactly. The police? They dismissed my concerns as overreaction. The building manager? He seemed disconnected, more interested in avoiding trouble than protecting tenants. Back inside the apartment, I double-locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. Emma sat on the couch, her expression somber but resolute. "I'm going to stay with you tonight," she said. "You shouldn't be alone." I wanted to argue, but the honesty in her voice left me silent. I was grateful and terrified all at once. We settled into the small living room, lights on, phones charged and close by. Emma kept glancing out the window, as if expecting to see someone waiting there. I could barely breathe, the adrenaline still pulsing through me, but at least I wasn't alone. Hours passed, no knocks, no footsteps in the hall, no shadows lurking beyond the glass. The city hummed softly outside, indifferent and vast. I finally felt some relief, however fragile. The watcher was still out there, somewhere, but tonight, at least, I wasn't the only one looking back. The ordinary had not returned, but the presence of another person beside me held a small promise that maybe, somehow, this could end. Or at least, that I wouldn't have to face it alone. For now, that was enough. I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating insistently on the coffee table. The room was dim, the early morning light still struggling through the thick curtains Emma and I had left drawn all night. For a moment I wasn't sure where I was, the tension from the previous days still heavy in my muscles, as if I'd been holding myself taut for too long. Emma was still asleep on the couch beside me, her arm thrown over her face like a shield against the day. I reached for my phone carefully, not wanting to wake her. The screen showed an unknown number. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the accept button, before swiping to answer. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was low, calm, and unfamiliar. There was no greeting, no indication of who it was. Just a single line, said without any inflection, "You can't hide forever." The line went dead before I could respond. My heart slammed in my chest, and I sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. I glanced over at Emma, who shifted but didn't wake. I considered calling the police, but I had no proof of a threat beyond vague notes and sightings, and the last time I brought the police into it, they dismissed me. What could I say? Someone left notes, someone's watching, and now they're calling me? It sounded like something out of a movie, not reality. I set the phone down slowly and leaned back against the couch. The room felt colder now, as if the weight of that call sucked the warmth out of the air. I wasn't sure how much longer I could carry this. Emma stirred, blinking open her eyes. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah. Just a phone call." She narrowed her eyes but didn't press. Maybe she sensed the lie. I didn't blame her. After a while, we got up and made coffee in silence. The usual noise of the city outside seemed muted, like the world was holding its breath just like me. Emma insisted on staying the whole day, and I was grateful for her presence even when the quiet between us was thick with unspoken fear. We spent the morning pacing the apartment, checking locks again and again. I even put a chair under the doorknob. The small, ridiculous barricade felt like a talisman, a reminder that I was still trying to fight back. Later in the afternoon, I finally mustered the courage to step outside with Emma. We decided to walk to the corner store together, just a short distance down the block. The weather was gray and threatening rain, the air heavy and still. As we walked, I noticed the neighborhood had an odd stillness to it, like the usual afternoon bustle was absent. No kids playing, no lawn mowers, no groups of neighbors chatting on front porches. Even the mail carrier was nowhere in sight. The streets felt too empty. We reached the convenience store. The door was closed, a faded "closed for repairs" sign taped crookedly on the glass. I frowned at it, but Emma shrugged. Maybe it's nothing. I wanted to believe that, but then I saw it, the dark jacket, the same one I'd seen the man wear, hanging over the railing of the stoop next to the store. No one was around. It looked like someone had draped it deliberately, the sleeves folded over neatly, the fabric catching the dull light like a warning. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Emma nodded, her face tight. "Should we call the cops?" I shook my head. They won't do anything without proof. And besides, maybe it's just someone leaving stuff behind. We didn't wait to find out. We turned away and started walking back, keeping to the middle of the sidewalk, the weight of unseen eyes pressing on us from every direction. When we were halfway home, Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced down and paled. "It's a message. From an unknown number." Her voice was quiet. She showed me the screen. The message was simple: "Next time, I won't warn." I swallowed hard. The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. I looked around, but the street was still empty, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. We picked up our pace, hurrying toward the safety of the apartment building. The door felt heavier than usual when we reached it, and I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking. Emma's presence was a steady anchor, but even she looked tense. Once inside, I locked the door behind us and bolted the deadbolt. I peeked out the peephole. The lobby was empty, the hallway light flickering faintly overhead. Nothing moved. No footsteps, no shadows. But the sense of being watched hadn't left. The apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in with the knowledge that someone was out there, waiting, watching. That evening, Emma offered to stay another night, but I insisted she go home. I couldn't ask her to put herself at risk. She understood but didn't leave without a promise to call if anything happened. I sat by the window, phone in hand, staring at the street below. The city lights shimmered through the drizzle now falling, making the pavement gleam like glass. Somewhere out there, someone knew I was watching, just as I knew they were watching me. The ordinary was gone, replaced by a fragile, dangerous new normal. I didn't know how long I could hold on, but I knew that whatever this was, it was escalating. The notes, the sightings, the calls, it all pointed to one truth. This wasn't just about warning me anymore. It was about control. And the game was far from over. Story 4, Silent Chains Beneath the Moonlight. I hadn't meant to stay out as late as I did that night. It was just supposed to be a couple of drinks with my coworker, Mike, after a long Wednesday at the office. The kind of night where you tell yourself you won't go past 1 or 2, but the conversation drags on, and the bar crowd thickens, and the hours slip by unnoticed. By the time I glanced at my phone, the screen glared 1:17 a.m. back at me, and my stomach twisted with that familiar knot of unease, the one that signals you should have left an hour ago. I shoved my phone back in my pocket and decided to call a cab. There was no way I was walking home from this part of town, not alone and definitely not that late. The streets had emptied, the street lamps flickered intermittently, casting uneven pools of yellow light on the cracked pavement. I found a spot near the corner where the app said the driver would be, pulling my jacket tighter around me as a cold breeze raced past. I checked my phone again, but there was nothing new, no notification that the cab was close. Then I heard footsteps. Not the distant echo of a late-night pedestrian, but close, deliberate, I turned, expecting to see someone unlocking their bike or maybe a fellow night owl heading somewhere, but the street was empty. Just the shadows stretching long and dark between the buildings. I chalked it up to nerves and told myself to breathe slower. My phone buzzed suddenly, making me jump. A message from Mike. Walk you home? I stared at it for a moment. I hadn't realized how much I wanted that. I typed back yes, and started to head west toward the subway station, where we agreed to meet in case my cab took too long. My footsteps sounded too loud, too fast against the concrete. The night was too silent except for that. Halfway down the block, I paused. There was a man standing under the amber light of a street lamp, just ahead and to the side of the sidewalk. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there, hands in his pockets, head slightly down. I couldn't make out his features clearly, but he looked too still, too focused on me. Our eyes met for a second, and I realized he was watching me, a faint curl at the corner of his mouth like he was amused. I slowed down subtly, feeling my heart pick up pace. He stepped forward, matching my pace. I crossed the street without looking back, but when I glanced to the other side, he hadn't followed. I exhaled, letting the tension bleed out of my shoulders. Maybe I'd just been spooked, letting my imagination run wild in the quiet night. By the time Mike showed up, I was halfway at the station entrance, leaning against the cold brick wall and trying to steady my breathing. He looked concerned the moment he saw me, even before I said a word about the man. I shrugged it off. Probably just some guy hanging around, I said, but my voice sounded thin and uncertain. We walked out of the station together, the crowd thicker now, people spilling out of bars and restaurants, laughter and music making the air feel less heavy. I felt my tension dissolve a little. Mike joked about the guy being a weirdo, and I laughed, though the smile felt forced. We parted ways at my building's door. I thanked him again for coming, promising I'd text when I got inside. I watched him walk away, the streetlights casting long shadows behind him. The door locked with a click, and I leaned my back against it, feeling momentarily safe. Inside, the hallway was silent except for the hum of the heater. I flicked on the light and started up the stairs to my apartment on the 3rd floor. When I reached my door, I pulled out my keys, but froze for a second. There was a small piece of folded paper wedged in the crack between the door and the frame. I hadn't noticed it before. My pulse quickened again. I tore it free carefully and unfolded it. There was just one sentence, written in neat, almost clinical handwriting. You can't run from what's behind you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I checked the peephole in the hallway. No one was there. I locked the door twice and leaned against it, trying to tell myself it was a joke or some prank. But the words felt like a warning, and the man on the street felt like something more than random coincidence. I called Mike again. No answer. His voicemail picked up, cheerful and unaware. I debated telling him about the note, but I felt embarrassed by how rattled I was. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I just needed to get some sleep. I set the note on the kitchen table and turned on every light in the apartment. I even left the hall light on by the door. The apartment felt exposed under the harsh brightness, but at least it was visible. I checked the locks again, then tried to settle on the couch with a book, but my eyes kept darting to the window where the street lamp's glow filtered in. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice. Then silence. I was about to convince myself that the worst was over when I heard the sound, soft but distinct, of a footstep on concrete. Not outside, but on the fire escape, the metal steps that ran down the side of the building, just below my window. It was slow, deliberate, and there was a pause, as if someone was listening. My heart hammered in my chest as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, professional. "Can you see anyone?" she asked. I shook my head, though she couldn't see me. The footsteps stopped, and the night was still again. "I'm sending someone right now," she assured me. I sat against the wall beneath the window, phone pressed to my ear, eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the fire escape. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights appeared outside. The footsteps were gone, the street was empty, but a uniformed officer knocked on my door, inquiring if I was okay. I showed him the note, explained the man on the street, the footsteps on the fire escape. He took notes, spoke carefully, and told me he'd have patrols in the area for the rest of the night. I thanked him, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. After he left, I closed every blind and curtain and double-checked the locks one last time. I didn't sleep well that night, but at least the immediate threat seemed to have passed. Still, the note remained on the table, a quiet reminder that someone had been closer than I ever realized. The morning light was thin and gray as it filtered through the curtains, but I welcomed it. After the night I'd had, any kind of daylight felt like a small victory. I lay in bed for a while, feeling the weight of exhaustion press against me, but also an underlying tension that no amount of sleep could shake, like the note was still sitting on the kitchen table, glowing quietly in the dark corners of my mind. I told myself I had to act normal. I had to move past this. I needed to go to work. I couldn't let that strange man, or whoever left that note, dictate the rhythm of my days. So, after breakfast, a piece of toast and a cup of coffee I barely tasted, I texted Mike. No reply. I called. Voicemail again. I figured he was probably busy, or maybe still asleep. The morning passed slowly. I tried to focus on the usual things: emails, dossiers, meetings. The office was crowded but familiar, a place where faces and names blended into a comforting monotony. But I couldn't stop glancing at the clock, counting down until I could head home again, lock the door behind me, and feel whatever fragile safety I had left. I told my manager I wasn't feeling great and left early, deciding that maybe the fresh air would help. The walk home was uneventful, the streets bustling with the usual midday crowd. No one lingered near me, no strange glances or sudden silences. The city felt indifferent, which was both comforting and unsettling. When I reached my building, I noticed something odd. My doorframe bore a faint scratch near the lock, thin, deliberate, like a mark made with a key or a knife. It wasn't there before, at least not that I remembered. I ran my finger over it, heart thudding. It looked like a tally mark, or maybe just a careless scrape, but it felt like an extension of the note, a message left in a code I couldn't read. Inside, I tried to focus on mundane tasks: laundry, dishes, cleaning the kitchen. Each time I heard a noise outside, my head snapped up: a car door slamming, footsteps on the sidewalk, the distant wail of a siren. But nothing out of place, nothing threatening at first glance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I left the curtains open just a crack. I wanted to see if anyone was outside, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I sat on the couch with a book, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. The street lamp outside buzzed softly, casting long, trembling shadows. The hum of the city sounded muted somehow, like the world was holding its breath. Around 11:30, I heard the footsteps again. Not the clatter of the fire escape this time, but the slow, measured tread of someone walking down the street below. I held my breath, trying to gauge the distance, the direction. The steps paused outside a building across the street, then continued. I considered calling the police again, but hesitated. I didn't want to seem paranoid, and I wasn't sure if I could trust my own senses anymore. The next day, after a restless sleep, I was back at work when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it. It was a photo. The picture was grainy, taken from a distance. It showed my apartment building, but zoomed in on my third-floor window, the one I hadn't closed all the way the night before. The window was slightly ajar, the curtain billowing faintly. Someone had been watching. No words accompanied the image. My hands trembled as I showed the picture to Mike when he finally answered my call that evening. "What the hell?" he said, voice low and tight. "This is serious. You need to go to the cops right now." I shook my head. "I don't know. I don't even know who sent this. Or how they got the picture. What if they're closer than I think?" Mike was silent for a moment. "Look, let me come over. We can figure this out." When he arrived, I felt a flicker of relief. We sat in my living room, the lights dimmed low. I showed him the note again, the scratch on the doorframe, the photo. He frowned, running his hands through his hair. "Someone's stalking you," he said bluntly. "This isn't some random prank anymore." The idea sank in, cold and heavy. It wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about being watched, pursued. Later that night, I double-locked every door and window. I taped up the curtains so they wouldn't move in the breeze. I sat with my phone in my lap, the flashlight app ready to go, waiting for anything to happen. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. Softer this time, footsteps crossing the fire escape again. I pressed my ear to the window, heart pounding. Then a knock. 3 sharp raps on my door. I froze. Mike wasn't there. I hadn't told anyone else I was home. I didn't recognize the rhythm or tone. It wasn't a friend or a neighbor. The knocking stopped. I didn't answer. Minutes passed. Then silence. I called Mike, his voice steady and calm on the line. "Don't open the door," he said. I didn't. Eventually, the footsteps retreated. The city sounds returned, distant traffic, a late-night dog barking. The temporary calm was a relief, but the message was clear. Whoever was out there wasn't done. I realized then that I couldn't keep pretending this was just a bad night or a coincidence. This was real. It was approaching. And it was only getting worse. The next morning, I woke to the shrill buzz of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. I fumbled blindly for it, heart still heavy from the restless night. It was a text from Mike. Just 4 words, "I'm coming over now." Relief washed over me, but that relief was quickly drowned out by a new wave of anxiety. The idea of someone else entering my apartment felt vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. I'd spent the last 2 nights barricaded in, counting the creaks and shadows, and now I was letting someone else see what I was hiding from. What if he wasn't careful? What if the stalker followed him here? I sat up and glanced around the room. I'd left the curtains taped shut as I'd done the night before. The note was still on the kitchen table, next to my keys, as if it were a sinister centerpiece to my little domestic prison. I wanted to rip it up, burn it, or flush it, but somehow I couldn't. It felt like evidence, a message I had to hold on to even if it scared me. There was a sharp knock at the door, 3 times, slow and deliberate. I froze, hand hovering over the lock. I wasn't expecting Mike yet. Was it him? Or worse? I eased the door open just enough to peek out. It was Mike, looking worried but steady. His eyes scanned the hallway before he stepped inside. "Hey," he said quietly, stepping past me. "I thought you might want some company." I closed the door behind him and locked it twice. Mike dropped his bag by the couch and plopped down with a heavy sigh. "I've been thinking," he said, rubbing his temples. "We should get a security camera or something. At least have footage if things get worse." I nodded, grateful for his calmness. It felt like a lifeline, a tether to normality. But even that felt fragile. We sat in the living room for a while, the muted light from the taped-up windows casting long shadows. Mike's presence was comforting, but the silence between us was thick with unspoken fears. "Did you tell your neighbors?" he asked finally. "No," I admitted. "I don't want to freak anyone out. And honestly, I don't know if I should." Mike frowned. "You don't have to handle this alone. People notice more than we think." I glanced toward the window, the street lamp outside buzzing faintly. The city was awake, but my world felt smaller than ever. Around midday, I went to the local electronics store with Mike. The fluorescent lights and crowded aisles were a strange contrast to the tension simmering in my chest. We picked out a basic security camera system, something simple and wireless. I was surprised by how much it cost, more than I wanted to spend, but Mike insisted it was worth it. Back at the apartment, we started setting up the cameras, positioning them to cover the front door, the hallway, and the window facing the street. The whole process felt surreal, like we were fortifying a bunker instead of a place I once called home. Once set up, the live feed appeared on my phone. I watched my own apartment in real time, the images grainy but clear enough to catch movement. I felt a strange mix of comfort and dread. Comfort because I could see everything, and dread because it made me realize how exposed I actually was. That night, I tried to ignore the creeping unease. Mike stayed over, insisting I wasn't safe alone, and I was grateful for the company even though it made me feel childish. We talked quietly about everything and nothing, trying to cling to some sense of normalcy. Around 11:45, the familiar sound returned to the slow, cautious footsteps on the fire escape outside my window. My breath hitched, and I reached for my phone, fingers trembling as I switched on the camera feed. There. A shadow moved across the narrow metal stairs. Mike grabbed my hand, his grip tight. "Call the cops." I nodded, dialing 911 with shaking hands. The operator's voice was calm, but I couldn't stop my voice from cracking as I described the situation. The footsteps stopped just as quickly as they'd started. For a moment, everything was still, the air thick with tension. Then, a new sound. The sharp scrape of something metal against concrete, soft but deliberate. Mike tightened his grip again. "They're trying to get in." We moved to the door, checking the locks. All secure. But the noise continued, coming from the fire escape ladder, a slow, steady drag of what sounded like a crowbar or a similar tool. "We need to get out," Mike said urgently. "I'm calling backup." The operator told us patrols were en route and advised us to stay on the line. Minutes felt like hours as the noise persisted, scraping, dragging, sometimes pausing, as if the person outside was testing the defenses. Then it stopped. Complete silence, except for the distant hum of traffic. The flashing lights of the police cars arrived a few blocks away, not close enough for us to see them immediately but close enough for me to feel a wave of relief. An officer called up to us from the building's entrance. We explained what had happened, showed the camera feed, and gave descriptions. They promised to send officers to patrol the area and keep an eye on the building for the rest of the night. After they left, Mike and I sat quietly on the couch. The note from the first night still lay on the kitchen table, untouched. "I don't know who this is," I said finally. "Or why they're doing this." Mike's eyes were dark. "But they know you. And they're getting bolder." I swallowed hard, a cold knot settling in my stomach. "It's not about scaring you anymore," he said. "It's about control." We spent the rest of the night watching the camera feed, the glow of the phone screens the only light in the apartment. The city outside continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent to the fear that had taken root inside our walls. When dawn finally broke with pale light spilling into the room, I felt exhausted, drained in a way I hadn't anticipated. But I also felt something else, a grim determination. The stalking wasn't going to stop on its own. And now, armed with a camera and someone watching with me, I wasn't going to let it. For now, the immediate threat had been pushed back. But only just. The next few days slipped by in a strange blur. Mike stayed over as much as he could, and I found some comfort in knowing I wasn't alone, even if the fear still clung to the edges of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. The cameras worked well enough, though the grainy black and white images did little to ease my nerves. Every small movement outside my window made me jump, and I kept the phone close, the feed always live on the screen. Still, nothing else happened right away. No more footsteps on the fire escape, no strange noises or knocks. It felt like maybe, just maybe, the police presence, or the cameras, had been enough to keep whoever it was at bay. I told myself that a dozen times, but the knot in my stomach never fully went away. On the fourth day, I decided to go back to work. I needed to try and reclaim some normalcy, even if the corners of my mind stayed alert. Mike agreed to come by after, and I promised I'd stay in touch. The morning wasn't terrible. I kept the blinds closed at the office window, staring down the street out of habit, but at least I wasn't jumping at every shadow anymore. The walk home was the same familiar route, but the street felt different, quiet, too quiet, as if the city was holding its breath with me. I tried not to look over my shoulder, but the feeling was persistent, nagging. When I reached the building, I paused at the door, checking the scratch on the frame again. It was still there, unchanged, deliberate. That mark had become a grim symbol, a reminder that my stalker wasn't done. Later, Mike came over like he said he would. We sat in the living room, side by side, both tense but trying to act casual. I noticed that he was glancing at the door more than usual, and I wondered if he was as on edge as I was. "I talked to a guy I know at the precinct," he said quietly. "He said there's been a couple of other incidents around the neighborhood. Not exactly the same, but similar. People feeling watched, notes left on doors, things like that." I swallowed hard. "So it's not just me?" "No," Mike said, shaking his head. "And the cops don't really have anything concrete yet. No suspects, no patterns. Just this creeping sense that someone's picking targets." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of it pressing down. I looked over at the window facing the street, still taped shut, the curtains barely moving despite the warm breeze outside. That night, I barely slept. The city sounds seemed louder, more intrusive. A car alarm blaring somewhere down the block. Someone shouting in the distance. I kept the camera feed on, watching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no shadows slipping by. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, my phone buzzed. A new message from the same unknown number. It wasn't a photo this time. It was a short video. Grainy, shot from a handheld device, moving erratically. I watched, stomach twisting. The video showed the stairwell outside my apartment door. A shadow moved quickly past the frame, just out of focus. Then the camera shifted to the crack near the door lock, the scratch in the wood that I'd noticed before. The camera lingered there for a few seconds, the faint sound of breathing audible in the background. And then the footage ended with a whisper so low I could barely make it out. "I'm closer than you think." I dropped the phone onto the couch as if it burned my hand. Mike's face drained of color when I showed it to him. "We need to report this," he said firmly. "They've crossed a line." I nodded, though inside I felt frozen. The line was crossed a long time ago. This was no longer just about fear, it had turned into something more sinister. Someone was invading my space, marking territory, daring me to respond. The police took the video seriously this time. An officer came to the apartment the next morning to take a formal statement and collect the phone. They asked questions about anyone I had disagreements with, anyone who might want to scare me. I told them about the man on the street, the note, the scratches, the photos, the video. They said they'd increase patrols in the area and promised to keep in touch. It felt like a relief to have official acknowledgement, but also terrifying because it meant I wasn't imagining things. Someone was watching me, tracking me, and the police couldn't stop it yet. Mike stayed over again that night, but the tension between us was different. We weren't just two friends trying to make sense of a nightmare. We were two people caught in a trap, trying to outsmart an invisible enemy. Around midnight, the city fell silent again. I could hear my own breathing, the faint hum of the heater, the soft creak of the floorboards as I shifted on the couch. Then, from outside, a new sound. A low, deliberate tapping at the window. I froze, heart pounding. The curtains were taped shut, but the tapping continued, soft, measured, like someone testing the glass. Mike grabbed my hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Call the cops." I hesitated for a moment, then did. The 911 operator answered immediately, calm and steady. "We're on our way," she said. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. The minutes dragged by in silence, every creak and groan in the building suddenly loud and intrusive. The police arrived within 15 minutes, lights flashing outside. I opened the door to the officer, who scanned the perimeter with a flashlight. "Any sign of anyone?" I asked, voice trembling. "Nothing," he said. "But we'll keep patrols here all night." Mike and I sat back down, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. The city outside seemed to breathe again, indifferent to the terror playing out in this small apartment. For now, the immediate threat had passed, but the tapping at the window was a brutal reminder. Whoever was out there wasn't done. They were getting bolder, more invasive. And I was completely exposed. I realized then that this wasn't going to end with cameras or patrols. It was escalating. The question was how far it would go and if I could survive it. The note still sat on the kitchen table, its message sharper now than ever before. "You can't run from what's behind you." And now, I was starting to understand what that really meant. The days after the window tapping felt like walking underwater. Every sound around me became distorted, amplified in my mind until I wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. Mike stayed with me almost constantly now, taking shifts so one of us could eat or shower, but mostly we sat in silence, watching the grainy camera feeds and waiting for the next sign. I wanted to believe the worst was over, or at least paused. But a part of me felt like a dam stretched thin, ready to burst at any moment. That morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and Mike quietly moving around the kitchen. It was a small, mundane thing, a reminder that the world outside my paranoia still existed. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and tried to smile, even though the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. He handed me a mug and said, "You should try to eat something." I nodded, taking a slow sip. The bitter taste grounded me. We talked about calling a locksmith to reinforce the door, maybe install a deadbolt or a security bar. I agreed, desperate for anything that might give me a sliver of control. Mike also mentioned changing the locks entirely, but I pushed back. I wasn't ready to turn my home into a fortress. Not yet. After a few hours, Mike left to run some errands, promising to be back before dark. The moment he closed the door behind him, the apartment felt emptier, colder. I sat on the couch, scrolling through messages I hadn't replied to, texts from coworkers and friends checking in. None of them knew. None of them could understand. I tried to distract myself with a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. The curtains were still taped shut, thick layers of black plastic blocking the light and any view of the street. I hated that I'd done it, hated that I was so scared I couldn't let even a sliver of daylight in. But the thought of someone watching me, waiting, was unbearable. Mid-afternoon, I decided to take a shower despite the knot of anxiety tightening in my gut. I locked the bathroom door, but the sound of water hitting the tiles was too loud, too exposed. I kept imagining that someone was outside, behind the walls, listening. When I stepped out, the apartment was still. Empty and quiet except for the ticking clock. I checked my phone. No new messages. No calls. The silence pressed on me like a physical weight. I sat back down on the couch, phone in hand, and started scrolling again. It was then that I noticed the camera feed was offline. The app showed no signal where the live images should have been. I frowned and tapped the screen, trying to refresh it. Nothing. A cold flutter of panic hit my stomach. I stood and walked to the router. Everything looked normal, lights blinking green and blue, but the camera feed stayed dead. I tried rebooting the router, unplugging it and plugging it back in, but the feed didn't return. The security cameras. Someone had disabled them. My heart thudded against my ribs, hot and fast. I grabbed my phone and called Mike. "Hey," he said, voice lighter than I felt. "What's up?" "The cameras are down. The feed's dead." I tried everything. His tone shifted, becoming serious almost immediately. "Did you check the plugs? The batteries?" "Yeah. Router's fine, nothing's unplugged, but the feed is gone." "Okay." "Maybe a glitch," he said, though I heard a hesitation. "I'll be back in 30. Don't open the door to anyone you don't know." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "I won't." After we hung up, I paced, trying to think. If someone had disabled the cameras, they'd been inside. That meant the locks weren't enough, and whatever sense of security they gave me was shattered. The afternoon darkened quickly outside the taped windows. The room grew dim, but I refused to turn on the lights. The silence felt suffocating and oppressive, but I didn't want to alert whoever might be watching. About an hour later, I heard a faint noise from the hallway. Soft scraping, like something gentle but persistent against the floor. My breath caught, and I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting for more, but only the hum of the heater filled the silence. Then, the unmistakable creak of the door handle turning. My heart slammed against my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to lock the door, to hide. But my door didn't open. Instead, the handle turned slowly, and then stopped. I didn't move. After what felt like an eternity, the handle clicked back into place, and I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. My legs finally gave out, and I sank onto the floor, phone in hand, trembling. I called Mike again, but he didn't answer. Panic surged, cold and raw, as I realized how truly alone I was. Minutes stretched on. I debated calling the police, but the officer's earlier words echoed in my mind, "We'll keep patrols here all night." But if someone had just tried the handle, it was only a matter of time before they tried again. I sat against the door, clutching my phone, the note still on the kitchen table glowing faintly in the evening light. "You can't run from what's behind you." I wanted to scream, to tear up the note, to throw the phone through the window and run until I was so far away I could never look back. But I didn't. Because whatever was behind me was inside my building now. When Mike finally walked through the door 2 hours later, I was pale and shaking, barely able to speak. He immediately checked every lock, every window, then pulled me into a tight hug. "We have to call the cops," he said firmly. "I know," I whispered. He pulled out his phone and dialed. As I sat there, wrapped in his arms, I realized this wasn't just stalking anymore. It was breaking in. It was waiting, watching, testing me like an animal circling its prey. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, the distant honk of cars, the faint murmur of nightlife. But inside, my life was unraveling. We waited together for the police to arrive, the note burning in my mind, the darkness pressing in from all sides. For now, the immediate threat had escalated beyond notes and footsteps. It had become a breach, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. Story 5, Silent Nightfall, The Last Refuge. The morning started off like any other Tuesday. I woke up to the usual dull thrum of traffic outside my apartment window, blinking at the ceiling as the sunlight edged through the blinds. I didn't have anywhere urgent to be until late afternoon, so I took my time getting ready. I made coffee, scrolling through my phone for a while, then decided I'd finally tackle the pile of work that had been mounting on my dining table for weeks. I lived alone in a modest second-floor apartment in the city. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. The neighborhood was quiet during the day, just the occasional car or dog walker passing by. I liked that about it, peaceful enough to focus but close enough to downtown if I needed to go out. My neighbors were mostly older couples or young professionals like me, keeping to themselves. I didn't socialize much, I preferred it that way. After breakfast, I set up my laptop and notebooks on the dining table. The apartment was small, so every surface doubled as workspace or storage. I had the window cracked open a bit to let in fresh air. The faint scent of rain was in the breeze, though the sky looked mostly clear. I liked the coolness. Around mid-morning, I heard the front door open and close downstairs. I didn't think much of it. Our building had several tenants, and it wasn't unusual to hear footsteps or doors at odd hours. Still, the sound stuck with me, as if it broke the calm in an unexpected way. A moment later, I noticed a faint tapping noise against the window. At first, I thought it was the branches of the tree outside brushing against the glass. But the tapping was irregular, deliberate even. I glanced over, but there was nothing visible through the thin curtain except the green leaves swaying. I shook it off and returned to my work. The tapping stopped after a few seconds. Maybe a bird or something. I tried to focus, but a subtle unease had settled in my chest. It was silly, but the silence felt different now, as if it were holding its breath. Later that morning, I decided to go out for a quick walk to clear my head. I locked my apartment door and stepped into the hallway. It was unusually quiet. I didn't see anyone on my floor or below. The elevator was out of order, so I took the stairs down. As I reached the bottom landing, I noticed the building's front door was ajar, swinging slightly with the breeze. That was strange. Usually, the building was locked tight during the day. I stepped forward to push it closed, but the door resisted, as if someone had jammed it. A flicker of irritation crossed my mind. Maybe someone forgot to lock it after coming in or out. I pushed harder, and the door snapped shut. The lock clicked into place. I double-checked the handle. It was secure. I looked around the lobby. No one in sight. A low hum of the city outside drifted in. I carried on with my walk, telling myself I was overthinking everything. The neighborhood felt normal, familiar. Kids playing in a park a few blocks away, a few people walking dogs, the occasional car passing slowly by. I tried to enjoy the crisp air and the distant hum of life, but couldn't shake the creeping feeling that something was off. About an hour later, I returned home. The building was still quiet, but when I got to my floor, I noticed a flyer slipped under my door. I bent down to pick it up. It was a printed notice about upcoming building maintenance, water shut off for the next day. Routine stuff. I stuffed it into my pocket and unlocked my door. Inside, everything was as I'd left it. The laptop open, papers scattered. I sat down and tried to focus on work again, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept hearing the tapping sound, faint and rhythmic, from somewhere outside my window. I finally got up to pull the curtain aside. The tree branches were still, the street empty. I walked to the window and looked down onto the sidewalk. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing across the street, half hidden in the shadow of a parked van. I blinked and the figure was gone. Probably just my eyes playing tricks. It was still early afternoon, and the shadows were long. I closed the curtain and sat back down, trying to drown out the unease with more work. I told myself I was being paranoid. Around 3 o'clock, I heard a knocking at my front door. Sharp, deliberate. I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. I glanced at the door viewer. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peeked out. No one. I stepped out into the hallway and looked left and right. Empty. The only sound was the distant buzz of an air conditioner somewhere down the hall. I shrugged and closed the door, locking it. The knocking sounded again, this time softer and coming from the other side of the door. I pressed my ear to it. "Hello?" I called softly. No answer. I checked my phone, no missed calls or messages. Maybe a prank? A delivery? But there had been no package left by the door. I settled back into my chair, but my heart was racing. A few minutes later, the knocking came again, faster this time, more urgent. I held my breath and then heard a voice whisper through the door's crack. "Are you there?" My throat tightened. I wanted to tell whoever it was to go away, but something about the voice made me hesitate. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. I leaned in closer. "Who is it?" I asked. Silence. Then, a soft, almost inaudible, "Please." I grabbed my phone and texted my closest friend, Clara, to come over. I told her I wasn't feeling right but didn't explain much. She replied quickly that she'd be there in 20 minutes. The knocking stopped. The apartment was still again, but the quiet felt heavier now, as if the air itself was waiting. I sat on the couch, keys clutched in my hand, in case I needed to get out fast. My mind raced through unlikely scenarios, none comforting. Whatever it was, someone had been outside my door, and now they were gone. I kept the door locked, but the sense of violation lingered. The safe bubble of my apartment felt breached. When Clara finally arrived, her presence was a balm. She didn't judge when I told her about the knocking and the voice. We sat together, talking quietly, the normalcy of her laughter helping to push back the shadows gathering in my mind. For a while, the apartment felt like home again. But as night crept in, I couldn't help glancing toward the door, wondering if the knocking would come back, or if whatever had been outside was still lurking just beyond the thin walls. I tried to sleep, but the tapping started again, this time on the window. And I was wide awake. I spent most of that night sitting on the edge of the couch, watching the window. The tapping continued in uneven bursts, never constant, almost like someone trying to catch my attention without making a full scene. I kept my phone close, fingers twitching over the screen, waiting for some kind of message or call from Clara that I could latch onto as proof that I wasn't completely alone. But there was nothing except the occasional distant hum of a car and the tapping, always the tapping. When morning came, it was a relief. The sun slipped through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the floor. I hadn't slept, but the light felt like a promise of safety. I closed the window and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to block out whatever was causing that noise. Maybe the wind, maybe some stray branch. I tried to convince myself of the ordinary. Clara stayed for a good part of the morning, making coffee and chatting about work and weekend plans. She didn't mention the knocking or the tapping, and neither did I, Not really. It felt too strange, too fragile to put into words. But her presence was a buffer, like a shield against the dark thoughts that had settled in the corners of my mind. After she left, I tried to focus on work again, but my eyes kept drifting to the door. I locked it twice, checked the peephole, and even wedged a chair under the handle. Paranoia was setting in, I knew it. I was tired and jittery, but the sense of being watched, of something just outside the edges of my world, wouldn't let go. Mid-afternoon, I heard a faint sound from the hallway. At first, I wasn't sure. It was too soft to make out clearly, just a scraping noise, like someone running a finger along the wall or maybe the floorboards creaking under slow footsteps. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. Then the footsteps stopped. I stayed quiet, waiting, but nothing else happened. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I told myself it was probably the neighbors or the cleaning crew. The building was old, creaks and groans were normal. But when I finally moved, it was cautiously, as if I were stepping through a room full of broken glass. Later, when I went to the kitchen to make dinner, I noticed the window was open again. I was certain I had shut it tight that morning. The latch was undone, the curtains fluttering gently in the breeze. The window faced the street, about 4 floors down. I'd never leave it open unattended during the day. Someone must have come in while I was distracted. But the door was still locked, and nothing else was missing. I checked around the apartment, opening drawers, cupboards, looking for anything out of place. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints on the floor. It was as if whoever had opened the window had vanished without a trace, leaving only the faintest disturbance in the air. That night, I debated whether to call the police. There was no proof that anyone had broken in, no stolen items or damage, but the feeling of invasion was sharp and raw. I was tired of feeling like prey in my own home. I didn't want to live with this invisible threat hovering just beyond the walls. I settled on calling the building manager the next day to ask about changing the locks or installing a security camera in the hallway. Anything to feel a little safer. Hanging up the phone line still felt a little childish, but I needed to take some action. Before bed, I double-checked the locks and closed the window firmly. The tapping started again, softer this time, almost hesitant. I ignored it, focusing on calming my breath, telling myself it was nothing. But just as I was about to drift off, a faint noise came from the hallway outside my door. Not a knock this time, but a deliberate scraping sound like someone dragging a sharp object slowly along the wood. Heart pounding, I sat up and listened. The sound stopped abruptly, then came the softest click, like a door handle being jiggled. I didn't dare move. After a long moment, I heard footsteps running away down the hall. The next morning, I told Clara everything. She was furious and insisted I call the police immediately. I wanted to, but I hesitated. The sounds could be explained by the old building settling or someone else entirely. But the thought that someone had tried to get in, tried to intimidate me, was terrifying. Clara stayed with me that day. We went to the building manager together, and I asked about the locks and cameras. He said the building was old and the security system was minimal, but he'd arrange for a locksmith to come by and change the locks that week. He also promised to remind tenants to remain vigilant and report anything suspicious. That afternoon, Clara and I sat by the window, watching the street below. I felt the eyes on me again, a feeling I hadn't dared admit before. Across the road, a man stood under the awning of a closed store, smoking a cigarette. He wasn't doing anything unusual at first glance, but his presence knew too long. His gaze flicked up toward my apartment several times, each glance lingering a little longer. I swallowed hard and looked away. Clara noticed but didn't say anything. She just squeezed my hand. Later, as she left, I locked the door behind her and checked the window for the last time. The street was empty now, except for the flickering street lamps and the distant murmur of cars. I could still feel the weight of that man's gaze pressing in, like a dark cloud gathering on the edge of a storm. The tapping started again, quiet and irregular at first, then rhythmic, deliberate, like a signal I couldn't decipher. I pulled the curtains closed and sat down, keys in hand, waiting for the storm to break or for whatever was coming to make itself known. The locksmith came the next morning, just as promised. He was a middle-aged man with a worn cap and a faded jacket, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second thought. His tools clinked softly in his bag as he worked, the familiar mechanical sounds oddly soothing compared to the tension that had been building inside me over the past few days. He changed the locks without fuss, explaining in a low voice that old buildings like ours were easy targets for petty crimes and that security upgrades were a good idea. I half listened, nodding absently while watching the lock's tumblers shift and settle. The new lock felt solid, a small victory. After he left, I tested the door repeatedly, each lock clicking firmly into place. For a few hours, the apartment felt quieter, almost peaceful. I allowed myself to sit on the couch with a cup of tea, the warmth seeping into my hands, grounding me. I thought maybe the worst was behind me. But the relief was fragile. By late afternoon, the unease returned, creeping back in like a shadow. My phone buzzed, a message from Clara checking in, asking if I wanted to grab dinner later. I declined, saying I just wanted to stay in and rest. I didn't tell her about the tapping that had started again, faint and erratic at first, like a hesitant Morse code. It was coming from the window, the one I triple-checked that morning. The window was shut tight, the lock secure, yet the tapping persisted. I stood up and peered through the blinds. The street was bustling with the usual rush hour crowd. People passed by, faces blurred in the dimming light, talking, laughing, oblivious to me watching them from above. No one lingered beneath my window. Still, the tapping continued, irregular, deliberate. I pulled the curtain aside and pressed my hand against the cold glass. The tapping stopped the moment I moved. I waited, heart thudding. When I withdrew my hand, it started again, soft but insistent. A man's voice from somewhere below, muffled by distance, cut through the rumble of traffic. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was casual, almost conversational, nothing threatening. It was easy to convince myself it was nothing. Then, something caught my eye. Across the street, near a row of parked bicycles, stood one of the older men from my building. I'd seen him a few times, mostly in passing, a quiet sort who kept to himself. He was looking up at my window, hands in his pockets, the angle of his head suspiciously deliberate. His gaze didn't waver, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I quickly looked away, heart pounding in my throat. Why was he watching me? The thought felt absurd. Maybe he was just waiting for someone or checking his phone. Yet the timing was too precise to ignore. I closed the curtains and locked the window again, but the tapping didn't stop immediately. It lingered like a fading echo. Later, I tried to distract myself with work, but my fingers hovered over the keyboard uselessly. Every few minutes, I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see a shadow or a figure lurking just beyond the glass. When the sky darkened, I heard a soft knock on the door. My breath caught. I wasn't expecting anyone. I didn't answer immediately. The knock came again, more urgent this time, but still quiet. I peeked through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door a crack and looked down the hallway. Empty. Then, as I closed the door, I noticed a scrap of paper slipped under it. I hesitated before picking it up. The note was written hastily in pencil. Stop looking. No signature. A cold wave washed over me. My hands trembled slightly as I balled the paper into a fist and tossed it into the trash bin. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak and groan of the building sounded amplified. The tapping on the window resumed in fits and starts. I kept the curtains closed, hoping the darkness would shield me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Barely audible but clear enough to freeze me in place. They stopped outside my door. Then, a pause. Then, a faint scratching like nails or keys dragged along the wood. I gripped my phone tightly, ready to call Clara or the police. The scratching stopped abruptly. The hallway fell silent. Minutes passed. No knock. No whisper. No footsteps retreating. Eventually, I heard the distant thud of another door closing down the hall. I didn't dare open my door until morning. When daylight came, I slipped out cautiously and checked the hallway. No sign of anyone. No footprints or scraps of paper. I called the building manager, my voice steadier than I felt, and told him about the note and the noises. He promised to increase patrols and install a camera near my door as soon as possible. Clara came over again that afternoon, bringing takeout and a calming presence. We sat together on the couch, the apartment bathed in soft light. I told her everything, the tapping, the note, the footsteps. She listened quietly, then said, "You can stay here tonight if you want. Just until they install the camera." Grateful, I nodded. That night, with Clara beside me, the tapping was barely noticeable. Her steady breathing and occasional soft chuckle made the apartment feel less like a trap and more like a refuge. Still, as I lay awake, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched, not just by the man across the street or whoever left a note, but by something darker, the knowledge that someone nearby wanted me to know I wasn't safe. The threat had escalated from vague unease to something personal. And I had no idea what would come next. The day started with an odd sort of quiet. Clara had stayed overnight, like she promised, but by the time I woke up, she was already gone. Her cup of coffee sat half-finished on the kitchen counter, its warmth long gone cold. I didn't hear the usual clatter of her keys or the soft click of the front door closing behind her. She must have left early, trying to be considerate. I blinked at the ceiling for a moment, trying to shake the residual tension from last night. The apartment felt different without her here. Less safe, somehow. I reached over to my phone and sent a quick message. "Thanks for staying. Can you come back this evening?" It wasn't really a question. Clara replied almost immediately, "Of course. Just text me when you want me to come by." The new camera that the building manager promised last week still wasn't installed. He'd mentioned a delay because of the weather and the locksmith's schedule. I understood the practical side of things, but the waiting gnawed at me. Every sound, every shift of light or shadow, felt like a countdown. I tried to focus on work. The routine was my only anchor: emails, spreadsheets, the endless shuffle of data and deadlines. It was the kind of work that demanded attention but left room for my mind to wander and often spiral. I pulled the curtains back a little, letting in the late morning light. The street outside buzzed with the usual weekday rhythm: a woman pushing a stroller, a man jogging with earbuds in, a couple walking their dog. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Or so I told myself. Still, the tapping began again. It was faint at first, a gentle rapping against the glass that I could have easily missed if I hadn't been listening. The same irregular pattern I'd come to dread. I stared down at the sidewalk, half expecting to see someone waiting, but the street was empty. I closed the curtains, but the tapping didn't stop. I moved away from the window and tried to drown it out by playing music on low volume. The sound was still there, persistent but just beyond clear recognition. Not quite a threat, but definitely a reminder. Around noon, I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, measured. different from the hurried pace of the neighbors or the cleaning crew. I froze. The hallway was empty when I looked out the peephole, but the footsteps continued, pacing back and forth just beyond the lens's reach. The faintest scrape against the floor, like someone shifting their weight or dragging a bag. I locked the door again, wedged the chair under the handle like before. The front door downstairs was locked tight when I checked later, and the building manager reassured me he'd spoken to the tenants about vigilance. Still, I felt watched. The afternoon dragged on. I ordered food delivery to avoid going out. The tapping paused for a while, but then started again just as I was about to eat, a slow, deliberate series of knocks, almost like a code. I debated opening the window to look out, but the memory of the open window from a few days ago stopped me. Instead, I stood by the door, pressing my ear against the wood, trying to detect any sound from the hallway. Nothing. Clara messaged mid-afternoon, asking how I was feeling. I told her honestly that I was on edge, that the tapping and footsteps hadn't stopped. She suggested I call the police if I felt unsafe, but I wasn't sure what they could do without evidence. As evening approached, the sound outside grew louder. The footsteps came again, this time accompanied by low murmurs I couldn't quite make out. I pressed my eye to the peephole but saw only darkness and the faint outline of the hallway light. Then, from somewhere further down the hall, I heard a voice. Clear, low, and irritated. "She's in there," it said. My heart leapt. The voice wasn't muffled. It was close enough that I could have sworn I heard the speaker's breath. I didn't respond. I kept still, frozen. The footsteps retreated slowly, but the tapping on the window returned with renewed urgency. I counted the knocks, 3 short, 2 long, and 1 more short. The rhythm was deliberate, without variation. I grabbed my phone and dialed Clara, whispering for her to come over as soon as possible. She promised she was on her way. I sat on the couch, the chair still wedged under the door handle, clutching my keys like a talisman. My mind reeled through every worst-case scenario: someone breaking in, being trapped, having no way out. Time crawled. The apartment grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon. Then, the tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe the ordeal was over. The silence was so complete that I could hear the faint humming of the heater and the distant rumble of traffic below. Then, the doorbell rang. It was sharp, unexpected, cutting through the quiet like a knife. I didn't move. The bell rang again, more insistently. I peeked through the peephole. No one. Clara's message came through at that moment. "I'm outside. Call if you need me." Relief flooded my chest, but it was tangled with fear. Someone was here, even if it wasn't the stranger who had been tormenting me. I unlocked the door just a crack and saw Clara's face illuminated by the hallway light, her expression tense but steady. I let her in. She took one look around, checking the locks and windows with practiced eyes, then sat beside me on the couch. "We need to figure out who's doing this," she said quietly. "And fast." I nodded, exhausted but grateful. The sense of being alone had lifted, replaced by a fragile, wary alliance. For now, the immediate threat felt at bay. But the message was clear: whoever was outside wasn't finished. And I wasn't safe yet. That night, Clara stayed again. Her presence felt like a shield around me, though I knew it was only temporary. The tapping persisted, but with her here, it felt less malicious, more like a nuisance than a threat. We sat on the couch for hours, talking quietly, the glow from the street lamp filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows that flickered softly against the walls. Every now and then, I glanced toward the window, fingers clenched around my cup, but I didn't want to say anything about it. To admit how much the sound rattled me still felt like giving the intruder power. Clara fell asleep first, curled up under a blanket with her phone tucked beside her. I was wide awake, staring at the locked window, watching the horizon darken beyond the faint outline of rooftops and chimneys. The tapping came again, light, steady, almost impatient. I didn't look outside this time. Instead, I buried my face in my hands. I thought the locks and the promise of cameras would make a difference. But nothing felt safe anymore. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Clara stirred and opened her eyes. "It's the building manager," she whispered, showing me the screen. The text was brief: camera installation delayed again. New date next week. I exhaled slowly, the weight of the delay settling on my chest like a stone. We'd been waiting for 2 weeks already, and the uncertainty gnawed at me day and night. After that, neither of us spoke much. I was exhausted, but sleep didn't come. Every creak in the building sounded like footsteps. Every distant siren felt like it was echoing from just outside my door. In the early hours, Clara stirred again. "I'm going to check the kitchen," she said softly. "Make some water." The apartment felt bigger and emptier when she was up and moving. I stayed where I was, listening to the soft rhythm of her steps fade away. Then, a sudden sharp noise, not tapping, but a loud rattle, came from the window. It was the sound of something slamming against the glass. My heart jumped into my throat. I stood up and moved toward the window cautiously, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. The street was empty. No one in sight. Only an empty sidewalk, slick with rain from earlier, and the faint gleam of a discarded soda can rolling slightly in the breeze. I closed the curtains quickly, the fabric snapping shut like a shield. Clara returned seconds later, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, locking the window again, triple-checking the latch. We sat back down, but the air between us had shifted. The noise wasn't the polite tapping anymore. It was a message, unmistakable in its escalation. Someone was testing boundaries. The next morning, I felt hollow when I woke. Clara was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. The light streaming in wasn't enough to chase away the shadows that clung to me. I debated calling the police again, but hesitated. With no visible signs of break-in or assault, what could they do? I wasn't sure I wanted to admit how scared I really was. Later that day, Clara took my phone from me and called anyway, speaking in clipped, no-nonsense tones. She explained the ongoing harassment, the notes, the noises, the strange figures outside. The dispatcher promised to have an officer check the building, though she warned that without more concrete evidence, options would be limited. I was grateful for Clara's intervention, but the helplessness lingered. Around mid-afternoon, the building manager called. His voice was tired but apologetic. Apparently, a storm had damaged the equipment needed for the camera installation. He was trying to get another team out as soon as possible but couldn't guarantee a fixed date. I closed my eyes and ran a hand through my hair. The protective barrier I'd hoped for was slipping farther out of reach. That evening, Clara left with a promise to come back the next day. I locked the door behind her, wedged the chair under the handle again, and double-checked the window. The tapping started almost immediately after the door clicked shut. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard something new, a faint shuffling sound in the hallway outside. Not footsteps, but footsteps dragging or scraping along the floor in a slow, hesitant rhythm. My breath caught as I pressed my ear to the door. The scraping grew louder, then stopped abruptly. A muffled whisper followed, barely intelligible, but a name slipped through clearly. Emily. My name. I pulled back, heart pounding so hard I was sure the person outside could hear it through the door. The whisper came again, closer this time. Emily, we just want to talk. I swallowed hard, caught between the urge to bolt and the paralyzing fear of opening the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed Clara's number, my fingers trembling. It went straight to voicemail. I left a hurried message, "Please come home. Something's outside my door." The doorbell rang then, 3 short chimes. I didn't answer. The tapping on the window switched to a frantic pounding. I sat down on the floor, back against the door, breathing shallow and fast. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, then the footsteps retreated, fading down the hall. When I finally stood, legs weak, I peered through the peephole. No one. Only an empty hallway bathed in yellow light, the shadows stretching long and strange. I called Clara again, no answer. I debated calling the police myself but hesitated, afraid that involvement might provoke whoever was outside. Instead, I locked the door, wedged the chair firmly, and sat by the window with the curtains only slightly ajar. The street below was quiet, the night deep and cold. Hours passed. No more knocking. No more tapping. No voices. Just the slow, steady pulse of my heartbeat and the distant hum of the city. When Clara finally came back early the next morning, her face was drawn and serious. "I called the cops while I was on my way," she said. "They're going to patrol the building tonight." Relief flooded me like cold water, sharp and immediate. For the first time in days, the apartment felt less like a trap. But as we sat there side by side, I couldn't stop staring at the window. Because somewhere beneath the streetlights, beyond the quiet sidewalk, someone was still watching. And I knew this was only the beginning. Story 6, The Circle and the Dot. I had been working the night shift at the convenience store for almost 6 months when the first odd thing happened. It was a Tuesday, a little after midnight, and the parking lot was practically empty except for a battered sedan that always seemed to park near the far corner. The streetlights flickered unevenly, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The air was damp, the kind of chill that seeped through the thin fabric of my jacket. I was stacking shelves near the back when the bell above the door chimed. A man walked in. He was average height, mid-30s maybe, wearing a faded gray hoodie zipped up to the neck and dark jeans. His hair was shaggy, unkempt in a way that suggested he hadn't seen a barber in a while. His eyes scanned the store quickly before settling on the refrigerated section. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait that made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. I kept pretending to be busy, arranging cans of soup, but I caught him watching me out of the corner of my eye. He didn't approach the counter, just stood there picking up a few energy drinks, then put them back without buying anything. This repeated twice more. He seemed to be circling the store, touching items briefly as if testing their texture or weight, but never committing to a purchase. After about 10 minutes, he moved toward the counter. I forced a polite smile. "Can I help you with something?" He looked at me, and for a second, I thought he might say no, but then he asked, "Do you have any batteries? AA or AAA?" His voice was low and rough, like he wasn't used to talking much. I nodded and pointed toward the aisle where we kept small electronics and batteries. "Down that way, 3rd shelf to the left." He thanked me quietly and walked off. I noticed his hands jittered slightly when he reached the shelf. There were no other customers, and the hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 12:45 a.m. When he came back, he placed a pack of AA batteries on the counter and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. I rang it up and handed him his change. He gave a brief nod and headed for the door. Then he paused and looked back at me, his eyes locking onto mine for a long moment. There was something in that look, something too intense to be simple gratitude or acknowledgement. "Thanks," he said and laughed. I watched him go, a vague unease settling in my stomach, but I shrugged it off as tiredness. Night shifts tended to mess with your head. The rest of the shift passed without incident. I did the usual: restocked shelves, wiped down counters, checked the lottery tickets, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's visit meant something more. I tried to focus on the clock, willing the hours to pass. Around 3:15 a.m., the bell chimed again. This time it was a different man, older, maybe late 50s, wearing a leather jacket that looked too big for his frame. He had a thick beard, streaks of gray cutting through dark hair, and his eyes were bright but cautious. He came straight to the counter and set a bottle of cheap whiskey down. "Just this," he said, sounding tired. I scanned the barcode and handed him the bottle with a nod. He lingered by the counter, glancing around nervously, then leaned in slightly. "You know anything about that guy who was here earlier?" he asked in a low voice. I blinked. "The one who bought batteries?" "No, not really." He nodded toward the door as if expecting me to say more, but I shook my head. "I just work here." He sighed, took the whiskey, and left quickly. That exchange rattled me more than I wanted to admit. Who was this guy, and why was he asking about the man with the hoodie? I tried to bury the thought, telling myself I was reading too much into nothing. At 4 a.m., I was restocking the candy aisle when the lights flickered and dimmed for a second. The hum of the fluorescent tubes changed pitch, and a sudden chill ran down my spine. Outside, the rain started, pattering softly against the windows. The store felt smaller suddenly, more enclosed. Then, just as I was about to check my phone, the bell jingled again. I looked up, expecting the usual late-night customer, but the entrance was empty. A draft swept in, carrying a faint, sour smell, something like old sweat and burning rubber. I stepped outside cautiously and scanned the lot. The sedan was still there, but the man in the hoodie was nowhere in sight. I returned inside and locked the door behind me, just in case. The air inside the store felt heavier. I wasn't sure if it was the rain, my imagination, or something else. 10 minutes later, the phone on the counter rang. I jumped. No one usually called at this hour. I picked up. "Hello?" A woman's voice, soft and hurried. "Are you the clerk working tonight?" "Yes," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "There's someone outside. He's been standing near your store for over an hour. He won't leave. I think he's watching you." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, heart pounding. I didn't recognize the number. I debated calling the police but hesitated. What if it was a prank? Or worse, what if the caller was the one watching me and wanted me to panic? I turned off the phone and locked it in the backroom drawer. Slowly, I walked to the front windows, peering out. The rain had thickened, blurring the view. Through the haze, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the parking lot, half hidden by the shadows. The rest of the shift ticked by in an uneasy silence. I kept glancing at the door, expecting someone to come in, but no one did. When the morning sun finally began to seep through the grimy windows, I locked up and stepped outside. The sedan was gone. The parking lot was empty except for a few puddles reflecting the gray sky. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night lift just a little. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences. Maybe I was overthinking everything. But as I walked to my car, I noticed something on the ground near the entrance, a small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up and unfolded it carefully. There were no words, only a roughly drawn circle with a single dot in the center. It looked like it had been sketched anxiously, with short, jagged strokes. I shoved it into my pocket and got into my car, locking the doors behind me. Whatever had been happening that night wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days after that night passed in a strange, dull blur. I went back to work, kept my head down, and tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was watching me, or maybe waiting. The weird little circle on the paper stayed folded in my pocket, a silent reminder of that uneasy shift. I didn't have the energy or courage to show it to anyone who would believe me. And even if they did, what could they do? It was just a drawing. No message, no name, no explanation. The routine settled back into place, but the air felt different. The store, usually just a spot on a long, empty street where people briefly stopped for snacks or cigarettes, felt heavier, like the walls had absorbed the tension from that night and held it close. Tuesday came again. Night shift. Same old schedule. But I noticed something right away when I walked in just after 11 p.m. The parking lot was empty except for the battered sedan, parked near the far corner like clockwork. The streetlights still flickered unevenly, though this time the rain had stopped and the air smelled sharp, like it had been washed clean. A perfect night, if you ignored that sinking feeling in your gut. I locked the door behind me, flipped on the lights, and set about my usual tasks, checking the register, wiping down the counter, and restocking shelves. The hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder than usual. Somewhere between the candy aisle and the back room, I caught the faintest sound of footsteps in the parking lot outside, soft but deliberate. I glanced through the grimy windows. Nothing. Just shadows pooling under the streetlights, the wet pavement gleaming faintly. I told myself I was imagining it. I always did at night. Around 12:30 a.m., the bell jingled. I looked up, expecting a customer, but the door was empty. The air inside the store shifted, stale and heavy. I walked over and looked outside again, scanning the lot. The sedan was still there, but no sign of anyone else. I locked the door behind me, suddenly uncomfortable with the idea of anyone lurking just beyond the glass. I tried to shake it off and went back to the counter, pulling out a pack of gum to place near the register. Then, the bell jingled again. This time, the door opened slowly, and the man in the gray hoodie stepped in. He looked different somehow, more tense, maybe. His eyes darted quickly around the store before settling on me. He moved with that same slow, deliberate gait, but now his hands were clenched into fists. I swallowed hard. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Back for batteries?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked past me, heading toward the back of the store where the cleaning supplies were kept. I followed him with my eyes, unease coiling tighter in my stomach. He stopped in front of the mop bucket and crouched down, pulling something from the floor. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper, the same kind I'd found outside days ago, with that jagged circle and dot. He unfolded it slowly, staring at it as if it held some secret meaning. Then, without looking up, he said, "You saw it." His voice was rough, low, barely above a whisper. I did," I admitted, my voice uneven. He stood up abruptly, a flicker of something crossing his face, frustration, fear, and he tucked the paper into his pocket. "Did you understand it?" he asked. "No," I said, shaking my head. "What does it mean?" He hesitated, then looked around nervously before leaning in closer. "It's a warning." "A warning?" I echoed. "Not for you," he said quickly. "For someone else." That unsettled me more than anything else so far. Why was he here? Why bring that paper inside, only to claim it wasn't for me? And what kind of warning could it be? Before I could ask, the bell rang again. I turned to see the older man from a few nights ago entering, his expression grim. "Thought I'd find you here," he said bluntly, then glanced at the man in the hoodie. "You don't belong here." The man's eyes narrowed. "I was just leaving." "You're not," the older man said quietly. His hand moved suddenly, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a small pocket knife, the blade glinting in the fluorescent light. "Frozen," I watched as the tension between the two men ratcheted up in an instant, the quiet store suddenly charged with a dangerous, electric edge. "Easy," I said, stepping between them, heart pounding. "Nobody needs to get hurt." They both looked at me, then at each other, the hostility simmering beneath the surface. Finally, the man in the hoodie backed away, muttering something I couldn't hear, and slipped toward the door. The older man didn't follow, but his eyes stayed locked on the retreating figure until he disappeared into the night. I locked the door again and turned to the older man. "What's going on? Who are you?" He shook his head slowly. "Doesn't matter. Just stay out of it." I wanted to press him, but something in his tone told me he wouldn't answer, not now, maybe not ever. He paid for another bottle of whiskey, nodded at me, and left without another word. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the exchange, the paper, the knife. Who were these men? What did they want? And why was I caught in the middle? When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside and looked around. The sedan was gone, and the lot was empty except for the usual puddles reflecting the pale sky. I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket and stared at the circle and dot one more time. Maybe it was just a code between those two men, some message I wasn't meant to understand. Or maybe it was something worse. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something was coming. And it was getting closer. The night after that second shift, I didn't sleep. I sat up in my small apartment, the curtains drawn tight against the dark outside. The circle and dot on the crumpled paper felt heavier in my pocket. I kept turning it over with my fingertips, trying to will it into meaning something I could understand. But it was just a symbol, blank except for the jagged strokes that looked like they'd been hurriedly drawn in a moment of panic. I wanted to throw it away, burn it even, but I couldn't. There was a strange gravity to it, like it was tethered to whatever dark thread was pulling at this whole mess. The phone rang twice just before midnight. I didn't answer. Not again. Whoever it was hadn't spoken since that first call, and the silence on the other end made my skin crawl. At 11:45 p.m., I left my apartment and walked to the convenience store. I needed to be there early, just to see if anything out of the ordinary was waiting for me. The air was cool, the kind of night that smelled faintly of wet leaves and exhaust fumes. The street was empty, save for a few scattered puddles reflecting the orange streetlights. The windows of the store were fogged from the inside, but the interior lights were already on. I pushed the door open, a small bell chimed, too sharp in the quiet night, and stepped inside. The store looked normal enough, rows of snacks, the humming of the refrigerators, the usual clutter on the counter. Except for one thing. The man in the gray hoodie was behind the counter, sitting on a stool. His face was shadowed by the hood pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look up when I entered. "Hey," I said cautiously, trying not to sound startled. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, fingers twitching slightly. I walked closer. "You're not supposed to be here." "It's not about me," he said finally, voice low and rough, breaking the silence like a crack in glass. Before I could respond, the older man, leather jacket, the beard streaked with gray, stepped out from the aisle near the back. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "Didn't expect to find you here so early," the older man said, nodding toward me. I swallowed hard, heart pounding. The two men exchanged a look that was all knives and shadows. "We need to talk," the man in the hoodie said, voice barely above a whisper. "Away from the cameras." I glanced at the ceiling. The security cameras blinked red, recording every inch of the store. "There's no place like that here." He sighed and shook his head. "Outside. Behind the dumpster." I hesitated. The back alley was narrow and poorly lit, and I'd seen how quickly things could go wrong after dark. "Fine," the older man said, "but not long." I followed as they exited through the back door. The cold air hit me immediately, sharper than inside. The alley smelled of grease and rotting garbage. A single flickering security light cast weak shadows, making the trash cans look like looming figures. The man in the hoodie leaned against the brick wall, still shrouded by his hood. The older man stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching me. I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "So, what's this all about?" The man in the hoodie pulled a small notebook from his jacket and flipped it open. He handed it to me. The pages were filled with hastily scrawled notes, times, places, names I didn't recognize. At the bottom of one page was the same circle and dot, drawn larger and clearer. "This," he said, "is a map." "Sort of." I frowned. "It looks like a mess." "It's not," he replied. "It's coded. There's a group of people who don't want to be found. They move through the city, watching, waiting. They mark places, people. That symbol means watch or target. That's why you found it outside the store." My stomach tightened. Why would they mark my store? He looked away, voice low. "Because it's on their route. And you're now part of the equation." The older man shifted his weight impatiently. "We don't have much time." I looked between them, trying to process everything. Who are they? Why do they care about me? His eyes caught mine, steady and serious. "Because you saw something you weren't supposed to. Because you asked questions. Because now they think you might interfere." I wanted to ask more, but the noise of footsteps echoed down the alley. I turned sharply. Two figures appeared at the mouth of the alley, their faces obscured by baseball caps and jackets zipped high. They paused, eyes scanning. I felt a cold sweat break along my spine. The man in the hoodie gritted his teeth. "They're here." Before I could react, the older man moved forward, stepping into the weak light. "Back inside. Now." We hurried back through the back door. The bell jingled faintly as it closed behind us. Inside, I locked the door. The security cameras continued to blink. The store was quiet again, but the tension was thick, almost suffocating. Who were those guys? I asked, voice shaking. "Lookouts," the man in the hoodie said. "They keep tabs on the area. Make sure no one gets too curious." I ran a hand through my hair. "This is insane." "Welcome to it," the older man muttered. They both looked exhausted, like this had been going on far longer than I wanted to imagine. I glanced at the clock behind the counter, 12:15 a.m. "Why involve me?" I asked again. The man in the hoodie folded his hands on the counter. "Because you saw the symbol. Because you reacted. Because you're still here." I swallowed hard. "What do I do now?" The older man glanced at the door, then back at me. "Stay alert. Don't trust anyone you don't know. Keep your phone on you, and if you see anything unusual, call the police. And don't go anywhere alone." I nodded, the weight of the night settling heavily on my shoulders. They both started toward the door, but the man in the hoodie stopped and turned back to me. "Keep the paper," he said quietly. "It's the only thing that might keep you safe." And just like that, they were gone. I locked the door behind them and leaned against it, my breath shallow and fast. The store felt smaller than ever, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name. Outside, the rain started again, soft and steady, washing over the cracked parking lot. And somewhere, beyond the flickering streetlights, I knew the watchful eyes were still waiting. the night was far from over. That next week, everything seemed to shift beneath me, like the ground had gone soft and uncertain. I kept the crumpled circle paper folded carefully in my wallet, almost as if it had become a talisman of some kind. I found myself scanning the parking lot every time I walked into the store, eyes flicking to the far corner where the battered sedan always parked. But the man in the hoodie didn't show up again. Neither did the older man. I wanted to believe the worst was behind me, but a knot of tension lodged itself in my chest, tightening with every passing night. The store felt smaller, more claustrophobic, as if those walls were watching me back. I kept glancing at the security cameras, wondering if they really captured everything or just what someone wanted me to see. That Tuesday, I arrived an hour early, hoping for a quiet shift, maybe some peace to sort my thoughts. The lot was empty except for the sedan, as usual, but this time the air smelled off like burnt plastic mixed with something sour I couldn't place. I shook my head, telling myself not to get paranoid. It was 11:30 p.m. when the bell rang. I looked up, expecting one of the usual late-night stragglers, but the door swung open to reveal an empty space. The cold air swept in, and something felt wrong. I stood still for a moment, heart thudding, trying to catch a glimpse of movement outside the glass. Nothing. I closed the door and locked it quickly. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned to the counter. The store's usual hum seemed to drop into a low, unnatural silence. I tried to focus on restocking the shelves, but every sound of the tap of my stocking boxes, the buzz of fluorescent lights, felt amplified, like the store was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, steady. Not the shuffle of a casual customer, but deliberate. I peered through the foggy window and saw a man standing by the sedan. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket that swallowed him in shadow. His head was down, but when he raised it briefly, I caught a flash of eyes, cold, calculating. I blinked, and he was gone. The air felt heavier, like the night had thickened. Minutes later, the bell jingled again. This time, a woman entered. She was average height, with dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Her clothes were clean but plain, and she moved with a careful precision that made me uneasy. She didn't look around or smile, just went straight to the counter and placed a black baseball cap down. "I want to buy this," she said without looking at me. Her voice was calm but low, like she was hiding something. I rang up the cap, my hands clutching the register awkwardly. "Is there anything else?" She shook her head and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the counter. I unfolded it cautiously. It was another circle and, this time drawn more crudely, almost like a child had scribbled it. "You know what this means?" she asked softly. I nodded, unable to speak. She glanced around, then leaned in closer. "You're in deeper than you think. They watch everything." "Who are they?" I whispered. Her eyes darted to the door. "People who don't want to be seen. People who make rules in the shadows. They decide who's safe and who isn't." I swallowed hard. "Why me?" "Because you're a problem." Before I could ask what that meant, the bell jingled again. My pulse spiked. Two men entered, the older man from before, the one with the leather jacket and gray-streaked beard, and the man in the hoodie. They looked different, tired, but with something like steel in their eyes. The woman stiffened and stepped back. "I'm done here," she said. The man in the hoodie nodded at me, then at the woman. "You should leave," he said quietly. She glanced at the older man, then at the door, and walked out without another word. The three of us stood in the store, the tension thick enough to slice through. The older man's eyes locked on mine. "They're testing you now. Sending people to see if you can be pushed." I felt the weight of those words settle on me. "Testing me how?" I asked. By watching how you react. By making you afraid. The man in the hoodie folded his arms. If you freeze, if you run, they win. I looked at the clock, 12:10 a.m. The older man stepped closer. You need to be ready. They won't stop. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the store plunged into dimness for a moment before humming back to life. The fluorescent tubes buzzed unevenly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. The man in the hoodie's hand twitched. We don't have much time. I wanted to protest, to demand answers, but the weight of the night pressed down too hard. The older man pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handed it to me. It was another circle, and this one marked with a small X beside it. That means danger, he said quietly. Close by. My stomach sank. Who? I asked. They don't show their faces, the man in the hoodie said. But they're real. And they're closer than you think. I glanced toward the windows, the dark lot beyond, and the empty spot where the sedan usually parked. The rain had started again, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the glass. I felt trapped inside a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The older man turned to leave. Stay close. Don't go anywhere alone. The man in the hoodie lingered a moment longer, then slipped out into the rain. I locked the door behind him and sank against the counter, heart pounding. Outside, the parking lot was empty again, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed in. I reached into my wallet and pulled out the crumpled paper. The circle and dot stared back, a silent warning. And somewhere in the dark, I knew the game was far from over. I arrived at the store just before 11 that Tuesday night, the sky already a bruised purple and the air holding the faint chill that always seemed to settle in after a clear day. The parking lot was empty except for the battered sedan, its dull paint catching the weak glow of the streetlights like a dull mirror. I took a deep breath, trying to push the knot in my stomach down as I unlocked the door and flipped the sign to open. Inside, everything felt too familiar, too normal. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the scent of coffee and stale chips hung in the air, and the candy bars sat in neat rows on the shelves. It was the kind of ordinary that felt forced, as if the place itself was pretending the last few weeks hadn't sunk into something darker. I moved through my usual motions, counted the register, wiped the counter, refilled the soda coolers. When I glanced at the clock, it was 11:15. The sedan hadn't moved. No other cars in sight. I caught myself watching the lot through the grimy windows again. Wind stirred the scattered leaves, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice before silence swallowed the sound. At 11:42, the bell over the door rang. I looked up, expecting someone, anyone, but the doorway was empty. A cold draft swept in, carrying a faint, sour smell like something had been burned recently. I stepped forward and peered outside, but the lot was clear except for the sedan. I locked the door and returned behind the counter, feeling on edge in a way I couldn't explain. 10 minutes passed. My fingers drummed on the countertop, and I fought the urge to check the back door lock again. Then the bell rang for real, and the door creaked open. The man in the gray hoodie stepped inside. He moved slowly, like always, but this time his eyes cut around the store sharper, less hesitant. They landed on me and held for a moment too long. His hands were clenched at his sides, fingers pale and tense beneath the sleeves. Back again, I said, voice steadier than I felt. He didn't reply. Instead, he walked past me toward the aisles, his footsteps soft against the worn linoleum. I followed, watching as he stopped at the cleaning supplies and bent down, pulling something from the floor. A crumpled piece of paper. The same jagged circle and dot. He unfolded it carefully and looked at me. They're watching more closely now, he said finally, voice low and tired. I swallowed hard. Who? He glanced quickly over his shoulder, eyes narrowing. The ones who make the rules. The ones who decide. The words hung heavy in the stale air. I wanted to ask what that meant, but before I could, the bell rang again. This time, the older man was there. His leather jacket looked heavier, the beard grayer, his eyes sharp as ever. He didn't smile. You shouldn't be here, he said bluntly, looking between the hoodie man and me. I'm not leaving, I said, feeling the tremor in my voice. The older man's gaze flicked to the door, then back. They're testing you. Seeing how far they can push. A cold sweat broke out along my spine. What kind of test? He moved closer, voice dropping. A dangerous one. We stood in silence briefly, the weight of unspoken threats pressing down. Then the man in the hoodie reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, placing it on the counter. It was the same symbol, but this time, the circle was crossed out with a thick black line. That means nowhere safe, he said. I traced the lines with a shaky finger. What do we do? Keep moving, the older man said. Keep your eyes open. And don't trust the quiet. The store lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows across the aisles. Somewhere outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trash cans and making the door rattle on its hinges. The man in the hoodie's voice dropped to almost a whisper. They're closer. At that moment, the back door slammed open. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. A figure stepped inside, tall, bulky, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the night outside. No hat, no hood, just a hooded sweatshirt zipped halfway up and a baseball cap pulled low over the face. But it was the way he moved, purposeful, calm, and utterly unhurried, that froze me. Hey, the stranger said, voice rough but not loud. I'm just here for some smokes. My brain scrambled. Who was this? Why hadn't the others mentioned him? The man in the hoodie tensed beside me but said nothing. I forced myself to step forward, masking my unease with a polite tone. They're over there, I said, pointing toward the cigarette aisle. The stranger nodded slowly and moved, hands in his pockets. He glanced at me once, then pulled a pack from the shelf and headed to the register. The older man watched him closely, hand inching toward his jacket pocket. The stranger paid and left without another word. The bell chimed sharply as the door shut behind him. For a long moment, the three of us stood in the quiet store. The older man let out a slow breath. They're ramping up. The man in the hoodie nodded. We're running out of time. I felt my pulse spike with a sudden surge of panic. What do they want from me? The older man's eyes darkened. Control. Compliance. Silence. My throat tightened. What happens if I don't? The man in the hoodie's lips pressed into a thin line. You get noticed. And then it gets worse. A flicker of movement in the parking lot caught my eye through the window. The sedan was still there, but now a shadow lurked behind it, shifting just out of clear sight. I swallowed hard, backing away slowly. Stay close, the older man said, voice grim. Tonight isn't over. The store's overhead lights buzzed unevenly, flickering again as if struggling against the growing darkness outside. I nodded, my hand shaking slightly as I clasped the crumpled paper in my palm. The man in the hoodie pulled his hood lower and glanced out the window. They're watching, he said. And I understood then that this quiet surveillance wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a promise of what was to come. The night stretched on, thick with tension and silent threats, the mundane store suddenly a battleground where every glance, every step, every decision mattered. I stayed behind the counter, heart pounding, waiting for the next move. because whatever this was, it was only getting started.